The letter had been sitting in Nora Calloway's desk drawer for 11 days before she finally signed it. She'd written it on a Tuesday, the same day Principal Hardwick had stood at the front of the faculty lounge and announced with the careful, bloodless language of administrators everywhere that Jefferson Lincoln Regional High School would be consolidating its humanities curriculum effective the following academic year. What that meant, stripped of its bureaucratic gauze, was this: the history department would shrink from 4 teachers to 2. The 2 who remained would each carry a full combined load of English and social studies alongside their history sections. The 2 who did not remain would be offered positions at the district's middle school in Rolla, teaching 7th grade geography and something called digital citizenship. Nora had taught APUS history, Missouri history, and a senior elective called the American West Myth and Reality for 31 years. She had been department chair for 9 of those years. She had sent students to state history competitions, to college, on academic scholarships, to graduate programs in history and law and public policy. She had spent 3 decades standing in front of rooms full of young people and arguing with evidence and passion and occasional theatrical flair that the past was not dead, that it was alive, in the specific way that mattered most, which is to say that it was still happening. She was 58 years old. Hardwick had not offered her one of the 2 positions. He had not needed to say so directly. He had said instead that the district would be prioritizing breadth of certification, meaning teachers who could cover multiple subjects, and that, with her distinguished record, Mrs. Calloway would certainly have a great deal to offer the middle school program. He had smiled when he said it, the smile of a man who has rehearsed his difficult conversations until the difficulty is no longer visible. Nora had sat very still in her chair. She had spent that evening at her kitchen table alone, because Daniel had been in Kansas City for the better part of 3 years now, in an apartment near his second wife and his new life. And she had looked at the drawer where she kept her blank stationery, and she had thought with startling clarity, if I go to Rolla and teach 7th grade geography, I will disappear. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, ordinary way that happens when a person stops doing the only thing they know how to be. She had opened the drawer and written the letter, resignation effective, June 30th, after which she intended to take possession of the Osage River cabin her father had left her 3 years ago, which she had not yet visited, which everyone in her family had been gently suggesting she sell. She had put it in the drawer and closed it. For 11 days, she had opened the drawer each morning, read it, and closed it again. On the 12th morning, she signed it. Her hand did not shake. She would remember that later, that her hand had been entirely steady. She put the letter in an envelope. She drove to school. She set it on Hardwick's desk before he arrived. She drove home. She sat in her kitchen and listened to the silence of the house she had shared with Daniel for 19 years, and she understood that she had just done the most frightening thing she had ever done in her life. She also understood that it was right. She was less certain those 2 things would turn out to be compatible. The phone call started that afternoon. Her daughter first. Claire, 31 years old, living in St. Louis with her husband and a career in hospital administration, and a certainty about correct decisions that Nora recognized as inherited Daniel's certainty, precise and well-intentioned, and occasionally suffocating. Mom, the word arrived already loaded. Mrs. Peterson called me. She said you resigned. I did. Effective June. That's correct. A pause that had significant architecture. Why didn't you tell me you were considering this? Because I wasn't considering it, I decided. Mom, that's okay. Walk me through the thinking here, because from where I'm standing, I'm going to the cabin, Nora said. She kept her voice even because she meant to. Your grandfather's cabin on the Osage. I'm going to stay there for the summer, and I'm going to figure out what comes next. That's the plan. That cabin hasn't been lived in for 3 years. I'm aware. The roof might be. I'll assess the roof when I get there. Mom. Claire's voice shifted into the register that Nora thought of as the emergency patient's voice, the tone of someone managing a situation they have determined is not going well. You are 58 years old. You're going alone to an isolated cabin on a river in the Ozarks with no what if something happens. What if the structure is compromised? You don't know anything about. I know quite a lot about the Osage River, Nora said. I grew up going there every summer. And I'm 58, Claire, not 88. The numbers are different. That's not what I know what you meant. She kept the gentleness in her voice, not as performance genuinely. I'm not angry with you. You're worried. That's reasonable. But I'm not asking for permission. There was a long silence. Will you at least call me when you get there? Every other day, Nora said. Unless the signal is bad. Your grandfather always said the signal at the cabin was unreliable. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be reassuring, it was meant to be accurate. After she hung up, her colleague Janet called, then her friend Barbara from the County Historical Society, then unexpectedly her brother Paul in Springfield, who had clearly received a call from Claire and had been drafted as backup. Paul was 4 years younger and had spent his adult life in comfortable suburban certainty, and he began his portion of the conversation with, "Nora, what on earth are you doing?" She told him what she was doing. She told him the same thing she told Claire with minor variations. She was polite throughout because she had no quarrel with any of them. They were worried, and worried people said worried things, and that was not their failing. But when she hung up the phone after the third call, she sat at her kitchen table and felt something settle in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. She was going. No amount of concerned telephone calls was going to change that because the alternative role of seventh grade geography, digital citizenship, was not an alternative. It was a particular kind of slow erasure, and she had spent 31 years teaching students to recognize the difference between a choice and an absence of one. She was not going to fail that lesson when it was her own life at stake. She packed on Saturday. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about most things. She had lists organized by category, annotated where necessary, clothes for variable weather, basic tools, hammer nails, screwdrivers both flat, and Phillips a small pry bar her father had left in the garage. A first aid kit with supplies she actually knew how to use. Food for 2 weeks, non-perishables, prioritized fresh produce for the first few days. Her reading glasses and a backup pair. Her laptop, which might or might not have signal. Her father's old road atlas because she had learned from Marcus Calloway that you do not trust a single source of navigation when the terrain is unfamiliar. She almost left without the box. It was in the hall closet, the medium-sized cardboard box she'd brought it from her father's house after the estate was settled, the one she'd labeled in her own handwriting, Cabin Dad's Research, and then set in the closet and not open because the weight of her father's death was still in the act of becoming something she could carry without effort. 3 years. She knew in the abstract intellectual way she knew most things that grief didn't follow a schedule. But she also knew that she had been setting the box aside the way you set aside a conversation you're not ready to have. She stood in front of the closet for a moment. Then she put the box in the trunk of the Subaru. She drove out of Jefferson City on a clear morning in early May, the kind of morning that gives no indication of what it's about to ask of you, and she headed south and west toward the Ozark Hills and the river she had not seen in 3 years, carrying her father's research in the trunk and her resignation letter in the rearview mirror. She had spent 31 years explaining to students that history is not simply what happened. It is the argument about what it means. She was beginning to think it was time to apply that principle to her own life. The cabin sat on the east bank of the Osage River, 2 miles south of Shell City, down a gravel road that had not been improved since at least the previous decade through a corridor of mature sycamores whose roots had long since begun reclaiming the edges of the lane. Nora drove it slowly because the Subaru was not a truck, and she was not certain what the gravel concealed, and because she had not been here in 4 years, not since the summer before her father died, and the descent felt like something more than navigation. It felt like returning to a place she wasn't sure still existed. The cabin was a 1940s structure, solid in the way that old things are solid when they've been built by someone who understood material, rough-hewn white oak, frame cedar shake roof, a covered porch running the full length of the river-facing side. Her grandfather had built the original structure. Her father had added the porch in 1978, the year Nora turned 10, and she had specific sensory memories of sitting on that porch through entire August afternoons while Marcus Calloway sat in his canvas chair with his notebook and his binoculars and narrated the river to her in the quiet, unhurried voice of a man who found the world endlessly interesting and considered it his primary obligation to make sure she found it the same way. He had been a high school history teacher too. It had not occurred to her until this exact moment, pulling up to the cabin in the May morning light, that she had never asked him whether he had chosen that path or arrived at it by necessity. The cabin looked like a cabin that had been locked up and left for 3 years. The porch railing on the south end had separated from its post and leaned at an angle. The cedar shakes showed at least 2 areas of visible displacement, which meant the roof had taken some weather without human supervision. The sycamore at the northwest corner had grown significantly, and one large branch was now in contact with the roofline in a way that needed to be addressed. The screen door hung slightly off plumb, which meant the frame had shifted. None of it was catastrophic. That was the first assessment. She stood beside the Subaru with her arms crossed and looked at the structure with the systematic attention she gave to problems she intended to solve, and she noted foundation appeared intact. The basic frame was sound, the issues were surface and correctable, given time and some physical effort. She was 58 years old. She had time. She was not, as Claire might have suggested, delicate. The inside was dusty and airless and smelled of cedar and river damp, and something beneath those, something she recognized as the particular smell of her father's presence, which was not sentimentality, but rather the specific truth that a person occupies a space over decades and leaves traces that outlast their physical absence. His canvas chair was still at the window. His bookshelves were still full. There were 3 pairs of his binoculars on the shelf beside the door because Marcus Calloway had believed with evangelical fervor that a person should never be more than arm's reach from a good pair of binoculars. Nora stood in the middle of the main room for a moment and breathed. She was not going to cry. She had cried for her father properly, completely, in the months after he died, and she did not consider revisiting that necessary or useful. But she was going to stand here for a moment and let the weight of the room settle. The weight of 31 years of habit told her she should be doing something useful. Unpacking, making a list, identifying the first 3 problems in order of priority. She stood still instead. She let herself have the moment. Then she opened the window, started the list, and got to work. The first priority was the roof. She didn't go up herself. She was not reckless, and the ladder she found in the shed was a 12-foot extension model that required someone to foot it, which was not possible when you were alone. But she could see enough from the ground circling the structure with her reading glasses and a flashlight aimed at the underside of the eaves to understand the scope of the problem. 2 shakes on the east slope had lifted and allowed some water infiltration. The interior showed faint water staining on the ceiling above the northeast corner, minimal, not structural, but it needed to be addressed before the next significant rain. She made a note: cedar shakes approximately 8 to 10 replacement. Roofing nails, caulking compound. She would need a person to foot the ladder. She would deal with that when the time came. The second priority was water. The cabin ran on a gravity-fed system from the spring uphill. Marcus had always called it the most reliable system in the Ozarks, which she now understood meant reliable when a human being was maintaining it. The pipe from the spring box had a section that had come loose from its bracket, which she could see and reach and fix herself with a pipe clamp from the supply box in the shed. She did it in 40 minutes, got her hands cold and muddy in the process, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem solved by her own effort without assistance. Water came when she turned the kitchen tap. She stood there and watched it run. She ate lunch on the porch, a ham and cheese sandwich and an apple, and the river 30 feet below the bank, doing what it always did, which was everything at once: shallow riffles over gravel, deep, slow pools under the cut bank, a family of wood ducks working the far margin in the easy way of creatures who have organized their entire existence around this one stretch of water and know it with the completeness that only permanence provides. Her father had loved this river with the focused, factual attention that was his particular style of love. He had not been a sentimental man in the conventional sense. He did not write poems or give speeches. But he had known the name of every bird on this stretch of water, had mapped the river's channel changes. Over 40 years of seasonal photographs, had spent a significant portion of his retirement corresponding with the Osage Nation Cultural Center about the pre-colonial geography of this valley. His love for the river was expressed in the way he paid attention. Nora had inherited the attention, if not always the subject. She was thinking about this, about what it meant to love something the way her father had loved this river, and whether that capacity was something you could redirect or only ever apply to its original object. When she heard the truck, it came down the gravel road from the north, a faded green F-150 that had seen decades of this terrain and showed it in every panel. It pulled up in the cleared area beside the shed, and a man got out, tall, lean, in the way of men who have not stopped using their bodies, with silver hair cropped close and the general appearance of someone who had dressed that morning for function rather than impression. He was carrying what appeared to be a covered casserole dish. He was somewhere in his early 70s, she guessed. He moved like a man 10 years younger. He saw her on the porch and raised the casserole dish slightly, a gesture that managed to be both a greeting and an explanation. "Walt Briggs," he said when he'd come up to the porch steps. "I'm up on the hill." He nodded north. "Saw the car come in yesterday. Thought your father always brought something when a neighbor showed up new to the season." He held out the dish. "Chicken and dumplings. I cooked too much for one." Nora came down the porch steps. "Nora Calloway, well, yeah," she said. "Marcus was my father." "I know." He held out his hand, large, rough palm, the hand of someone who had spent a career and a lifetime working with physical systems. "He talked about you, the history teacher." "I was," she said. "As of last month, I'm not anything in particular." He looked at her with the level, unhurried attention of someone who has long since stopped performing socialese and simply inhabits whatever moment he's in. "Retirement. Early and contested," she said, "by everyone except me." Something in the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. "Marcus said you were plain-spoken. He also said the cabin roof was in good shape," she said. He was wrong about that, too. This time the almost smile became the real thing briefly. He handed her the casserole. "East slope, 2 shakes. I saw it from the hill in March." A pause. "I can foot the ladder when you're ready to fix it." She held the casserole and looked at him for a moment. "I'd appreciate that." "Week from Saturday," he said, "if the weather holds." "Week from Saturday," she agreed. He nodded and turned back to his truck. She watched him drive back up the gravel road, the F-150 disappearing into the sycamores. She went inside and ate the chicken and dumplings at the table by the window watching the river. They were excellent. "What is, Claire called at 7. "You got there," she said. The relief in her voice was unmistakable, and Nora did not hold it against her. "I got here. The cabin is intact. I have water and the wood stove works, and I had chicken and dumplings from the neighbor for dinner." "You have a neighbor?" "A retired engineer named Walt Briggs, who lives up the hill and knew your grandfather and is going to help me repair the roof." She paused. "I told you I would be fine." "You told me you'd assess the situation when you got there." A small silence. "Are you, Mom? How are you not practically? How are you?" Nora looked out the window at the river going dark in the evening. Downstream, a great blue heron was standing on the gravel bar with the absolute stillness of something that has been doing this since before the invention of patience. "I'm in the right place," she said. "I'm not certain yet what that means, but I'm in the right place." That's not a very reassuring answer. It's an accurate one. She watched the heron. "I'll call you Thursday." After she hung up, she sat in her father's chair by the window for a long time, watching the river turn to shadow, and then to darkness, and listening to the sound it made, the sound it had always made, the same conversation with the same rocks, the same refusal to stop, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happy. That was too simple and not yet true. Present. She felt present, like she was occupying the exact coordinates of her own life for the first time in years. She went to bed at 9:30 with the windows open and the river sound coming in through the screens, and she slept 8 hours without once thinking about Rolla or digital citizenship or the curriculum consolidation or any of the 31 years of careful accumulated professional identity that she had just set down on Hardwick's desk like something she was finally done carrying. She would think about all of it eventually. She knew that. But not tonight. Tonight the river was enough. The days that followed had a quality she recognized from a long time ago, from the summers of her childhood, when time moved differently on the river than it did in the town. Not slower exactly, more granular. Each hour distinguishable from the one before it by light and temperature and the particular activity of the water, rather than by the clock and the schedule and the accumulation of tasks that constituted a normal teaching week. She was not used to this. 31 years of structured time had made her chronically aware of the hour, not anxiously, but automatically, the way a person who has spent decades catching buses eventually cannot look at a street corner without calculating the schedule. She caught herself on the second morning checking her watch at 8:15 for a class she no longer had to teach, and she stood in the kitchen holding her coffee and understood that unlearning that particular reflex was going to take longer than 2 days. She went to work on the cabin instead. Work was the thing she knew how to do. The south porch railing came first. It was a matter of relaying the post the anchor bolt had worked loose from the concrete footing over the winters, a straightforward repair that took a morning and left her with the specific satisfaction of having made a thing level that had been unlevel. The screen door frame required shimming, which she managed with cedar offcuts from the woodpile, and a patience that surprised her. The branch on the northwest corner she could not address alone. It required a chainsaw and someone steady on the ladder, but she mapped the cut and marked the branch with surveying tape from the supply shed so that the work would be clear when the time came. Inside, she cleaned with the thoroughness of someone who believes that the condition of a space reflects the seriousness with which you intend to inhabit it. 31 years of teaching had given her a particular relationship with physical space. She had always known intuitively that a well-organized classroom communicated something to students before a word was spoken. The cabin was the same. She wanted it to feel like someone was living in it, not camping. She found things while she cleaned. Not surprising things, nothing hidden, nothing alarming, but the ordinary accumulation of a man who had lived seriously in a place for 4 decades, a box of surveying pegs in the shed color-coded, with paint in a system she didn't understand. A coffee can full of soil samples, each labeled in her father's careful handwriting, with a location and a date going back to 1991. 3 notebooks spiral-bound in the drawer of the work table, 2 filled completely in his dense field note script, 1 half-finished, the last entry dated 11 days before his death. She opened the half-finished one. The handwriting was familiar. She had been reading her father's handwriting her entire life. The small, precise letters of a man who had learned penmanship when it was still considered a discipline, and who had applied that discipline to everything. But the content was different from the notebooks she had read as a child, which had been field journals in the naturalist tradition, birds' water levels, seasonal changes. This was something else. May 14th, she read, he had been using only month and day for years, not year, which was characteristic of someone who had been keeping the same record long enough that the year felt redundant. Spoke again with Thomas Redcloud at the Ocean Cultural Center. He confirmed that the section of river between Shell City and the old Brashear Ford matches the described route in the 1811 Pike Expedition notes, which puts the winter camp within a half-mile of this property. Have submitted the coordinates to the State Archaeological Survey. No response in 6 weeks. Thomas says this is normal. I am learning to find normal unacceptable. She read that last sentence twice. She put the notebook down. She was not going to read further today. She could feel the pull of it, the way you feel the pull of a door you are not quite ready to open. And she had enough self-knowledge to understand that some things need to be approached on schedule rather than on impulse. She made herself a cup of tea instead. She sat on the porch in the evening light and watched a belted kingfisher work the near bank with the focused efficiency of a creature that has one thing it does and does it completely. And she thought about her father spending the last years of his life pursuing something she had not known he was pursuing in the place she had always thought she understood. She had been a history teacher for 31 years. She had spent those years explaining to students that primary sources tell you things that secondary accounts cannot precisely because the person doing the writing was present and recording in real time without the benefit of knowing what would matter later. She had argued in classroom after classroom that the difference between a document and a story is the difference between evidence and interpretation. She had a primary source in the drawer of the work table. She was going to read it, but not yet, not tonight. She was going to give herself a few more days of practical work, roof and railing, and the slow physical task of putting the cabin back in order before she opened her father's last unfinished project and found out what kind of history he'd been trying to write and why he hadn't been able to finish it. But Walt Briggs came on the Wednesday, not the Saturday he'd proposed, but the Wednesday before driving down the gravel road at 7:30 in the morning with a chainsaw in the truck bed. In the same unhurried manner she was beginning to understand was not indifference, but rather the particular ease of a man who has made his peace with time. Branch first, he said by way of greeting, before the rain. She had not heard a rain forecast. She said so. Thursday, he said, significant. Best to get the branch down and the tarps on the compromised sections before it arrives. She did not ask how he knew. She had grown up with her father's weather instincts, which were grounded in observation and ignored official forecasts with the cheerful indifference of someone who has been right more often than the radio. She recognized the type. They work together with the efficiency of people who have each been competent alone for long enough that cooperation requires no negotiation. She footed the ladder, he made the cuts, they both cleared the debris. He handled the chainsaw with the deliberateness of a man who respects tools and has the scars from when he didn't. She noted the scars, left hand ring in index fingers the particular pale linearity of healed industrial injury, and did not ask about them. Engineering, he said when they were clearing brush. He had seen her notice. Hydraulic systems. Had a pump housing failure in 1987. Lost the tips of 2 fingers. He held up the hand, matter of fact. Still have the important ones. Hydraulic engineering, she said. Water systems. River management primarily. Corps of Engineers 30 years. Flood control navigation channels, environmental assessment. He paused, gathering a section of branch. The Osage, among others. She straightened. You worked on the Osage in the 60s and 70s before Truman Dam. He said the dam's name with a flatness that contained considerable more than flatness. She recognized it because she used the same tone for certain dates in American history that she could not discuss without her feelings showing around the edges. The reservoir flooded 60,000 acres of the Osage Valley. 76 communities. Graves. He stacked the branch section on the pile with a controlled precision that she understood now as the engineering habit applied to all physical tasks. I was 26 when I started on that project. I was not old enough to understand what I was helping to build. Nora was quiet for a moment because that was the appropriate response to that kind of statement. My father was researching the pre-colonial Osage settlements along this stretch, she said. I found his notebooks. Walt looked at her. He had a way of looking at things, the river, the cabin, apparently, her that was entirely without performance. Just looking. I know, he said. We corresponded. Last 4 years of his life. She had not known this. The sensation was not disorienting, but was adjacent to it. The particular vertigo of learning that the person you thought you knew had a dimension you hadn't seen. He never mentioned you, she said. He was working something out, Walt said simply. He didn't talk about it until he had something to say. She thought about their notebook. I am learning to find normal unacceptable. He was trying to get someone to pay attention, she said, to what he'd found. He found something worth paying attention to. Walt picked up the chainsaw. Whether anyone will pay attention is a different question. Generally depends on who's asking. He looked at her with that level, direct attention. History teachers sometimes have better luck than retired engineers. He went back to the tree. Nora stood in the cleared debris and thought about the box in the trunk of the Subaru, which she had not yet opened, and about the notebook in the work table drawer, and about the fact that her father had spent the last years of his life on something he hadn't finished in this specific place, corresponding with a man he'd never mentioned to her. She went to the trunk and got the box. She carried it inside and set it on the work table. She did not open it yet, but she looked at it for a moment, Cabin Dad's research in her own handwriting from 3 years ago, and she understood that whatever she had come to the river to figure out about herself was going to require her to first figure out what her father had been trying to say. That was, she thought, a very history teacher sort of problem. She was glad it was hers. The rain came on Thursday, exactly as Walt had said it would. She had tarped the 2 compromised sections of the east slope roof on Wednesday afternoon, after Walt left nailing the grommets down with the staple gun from the shed and using more overlap than was probably strictly necessary because she had grown up with Marcus Calloway's principle about preparation, which was assume the situation will be worse than forecast and work from there. It was worse than forecast. The rain began at 3 in the morning. She woke to it on the metal roof, which had a particular acoustic quality that her father had always called the best alarm clock on the Osage, and by 6, what had been a steady, moderate rain had become something that the radio, when she finally got a signal, described as a late spring, high precipitation event with potential for localized flooding. She went on to the porch in her rain jacket and looked at the river. The river had opinions about the rain. The Osage was not a particularly large river by regional standards, but it had the personality of a river that has been in a specific valley for a very long time and understands its own authority. The channel had already risen 6 inches since she'd checked it at 11 the night before she had taken a reference measurement, Marcus's habit marking the level with a surveying peg driven into the bank. 6 inches in 7 hours was not alarming. But it was information. She spent the morning working inside out of the rain. She organized the supply shed inventory. She fixed the hinge on the interior storm shutter that had been sticking since she arrived. She washed the windows on the west side because the sycamore pollen had turned them opaque. She checked the tarp anchors at noon and drove 3 additional nails per corner. She thought about opening the box. She made lunch instead, tomato soup from a can grilled cheese on the cast iron, and sat at the table by the window and watched the river continue its conversation with the rain. The water had taken on the color of old copper, the specific tint of Ozark Creek flood, red clay from the uplands carried down. She had seen this color every summer of her childhood. It meant water was running over ground that didn't expect it. The river was up 10 inches from the reference peg by 2 o'clock. She called Walt. "I see it," he said without preamble. She had learned in 4 days that Walt answered his phone the way he answered most things, directly without the social prelude. "Is this normal for May?" she asked. "Normal for a wet May. This one is wet." A pause. "You tarped the roof." "Wednesday afternoon." "Good." Another pause. "You know the high water mark on the cabin?" She hadn't looked. She said so. "North exterior wall about 4 feet up. Your grandfather marked it in the 93 flood. Blue paint faded. If the river reaches the mark, pack your important things and come up the hill." She put on her rain jacket and went to look. She found the mark faded blue exactly as described, 4 feet 3 inches from the foundation. She checked the reference peg. The river was at 16 inches and rising. She went inside and looked at the box on the work table. She opened it. The box contained her father's life's last work, organized with the methodical precision of a man who had always filed his research the way he filed his tax returns, clearly, correctly, ready to be understood by a person who came to them after the fact. There were 14 maps. They were hand-drawn on quality drafting paper in her father's careful cartographic hand, the kind of drafting that required patience and a steady eye and the willingness to go back and correct without tearing the paper. Each map covered a section of the Osage River Valley with the modern landmarks, roads, fence lines, the occasional structure drawn in pencil, as orientation and overlaid in ink with a second system of marks, village sites, midden locations, trail routes, seasonal ford crossings, burial grounds. Each mark was keyed to a reference number. The reference numbers corresponded to a typed index, 2 pages single-spaced each entry, citing a primary source. The sources were extraordinary. Spanish expedition records from 1719, Pike's journals from 1806, the reports of George Sibley, who had visited the Osage in 1811 and taken detailed notes on the settlements along this specific stretch of river. Federal Land Survey records from 1821, when the Osage had ceded most of their territory under pressure. Correspondence with the Osage Nation Cultural Center, 23 letters spanning 7 years. Her father had been building an archaeological and historical map of the Osage River Valley, as it had existed before 1830, before the removals, before the reservoir, before the modern road grid had erased the older geography from everyone's working memory, except the people whose geography it originally was. The last map, the one at the bottom of the box, the one he had not yet finished, covered the section directly adjacent to the cabin. The modern landmarks were drawn in. The Osage settlements were partially inked and partially penciled, meaning he had been in the process of confirming them when he ran out of time. There was a note clipped to this map in his handwriting. This section contains the strongest evidence for a significant winter habitation site, circa 1780 to 1810. The landform features elevated bank, south-facing exposure, spring access, sheltered tributary, match all criteria documented by Sibley and confirmed by Thomas Red Cloud. Coordinates submitted to Missouri State Archaeological Survey, May 2021. No response. Will follow up. This matters. He had died in June 2021, 3 weeks after that note. Nora sat at the work table with her father's unfinished map in front of her, and the rain loud on the roof and the river continuing its slow rise outside the window. And she understood with the complete clarifying understanding that comes only when a thing is finally visible what she was doing here. She was not here to figure out who she was without her job. She already knew who she was. She was a history teacher. She had always been a history teacher. The question was not what she was, it was what history she was going to teach and to whom, and whether she was going to finish what her father had started. He had left it here for someone. It turned out the someone was her. The river reached 24 inches by 9 o'clock. She was not afraid. This was worth noting. She cataloged her own emotional states with the same care she applied to external observation as a matter of intellectual honesty, because she had been afraid of the river since she was 7 years old. When a canoe had turned over in a rapid, she'd been told was safe, and she had gone under for what was probably 4 seconds, but had felt like the structure of the universe briefly rearranging itself around the question of whether she was going to come back up. She had been afraid of fast water ever since. It was a specific physical fear, not the broad ambient anxiety that some people carried, but the particular fear of a person who has experienced one thing once and is unable to fully argue their way out of its memory. The river was rising. She was watching it. She was not afraid. She thought about this. She decided that what had changed was not the fear, but the proportion. She was in the right place. She knew that with a certainty that was not bravado or performance, but rather the specific knowledge of a person who has stopped being in the wrong place. And that certainty was apparently heavier than the fear. It did not eliminate it, but it outweighed it. She checked the reference peg at 10 o'clock, 31 inches. She checked the north wall. The 1993 high water mark was at 51 inches. She had room. She went to bed. The rain stopped on Friday morning at 6:17. Nora knew the exact time because she had been awake for an hour by then, lying in the narrow cabin bed with the windows open and the sound of the rain on the roof, and she noticed when it stopped. The way you notice the absence of a sound you have been hearing for so long, you've stopped consciously registering it. One moment there was rain, the next moment there was the river, which had been there all along, but was now audible without competition. She dressed and went outside. The river had crested somewhere in the night. She could see the high water line on the bank, a faint debris mark 6 inches above the current surface, which meant it had reached 40-some inches at its peak and receded through the early morning. The yard held several small pools that had no business being there, and a quantity of deposited silt at the low point near the shed, but the cabin itself was dry, and the tarps on the roof had held. She checked the foundation, no infiltration, no soft spots, the base course of concrete block intact. She pulled the tarps while the roof was still wet enough to not require a second person. She rolled them carefully and stored them in the shed because Marcus Calloway had believed that the way you maintained your equipment between uses was a direct indication of your seriousness, and she had been unable to shake that particular inheritance. Then she made coffee, carried it to the porch, and called Walt. It held, she said. I saw the peak around 42 inches on my gauge, which puts it at roughly your 44 on the bank. He paused. The tarps. Held. I pulled them this morning. Good. She held her coffee in both hands. On the river, the debris from the night's rise was working its way downstream, a slow parade of sticks and leaves, and one incongruous yellow foam cup that had come from somewhere upstream and was navigating the current with the oblivious serenity of an object that has no idea it's being watched. I opened the box, she said. A pause. The research. He corresponded with you for 4 years, she said. He never told me. He told me about you, Walt said. Every letter. You were not absent from his thinking. He was working up to something, about the project, about asking you. Asking me what? To finish it. Walt's voice was even the way it always was, not flat, not without feeling, but unhurried in its feeling. He knew the maps weren't enough by themselves. He needed someone who could write the argument, make the case. He said, a pause. He said the difference between a document and a story is the difference between evidence and interpretation. That someone had to do the interpretation, and it needed to be someone who understood both the history and the obligation of telling it. Nora was quiet for a moment. He said that to you, she said, in the last letter, June 3rd. A pause she understood was giving her time. He didn't send it to you because he thought he had more time to work out the approach. She put the coffee cup down on the porch rail. The river moved below her, diminished now, back toward its own idea of itself. He was documenting a significant pre-removal Osage habitation site, she said, on or adjacent to this property. And 3 others within 4 miles, Walt said. But the winter site on your section is the largest. The landform matches everything in the Sibley accounts. He submitted to the State Archaeological Survey twice and was not taken seriously. A pause. The Osage Nation Cultural Center took him seriously. Thomas Red Cloud, she said. He's still there. He was waiting to hear whether you'd come. She processed this slowly, the way she processed significant information. Not fast, not with the artificial decisiveness that some people performed as competence, but with the genuine deliberation that she had always thought of as respect for the difficulty of things. Her father had spent 4 years building the case for a piece of history that had been erased first by removal, then by the reservoir, then by the silence of institutions that found it inconvenient. He had corresponded with a retired engineer who had spent his career working on the river system and carried his own obligation about what that had cost. He had built the argument, mapped the evidence, and left it in a box for the daughter who had spent 31 years explaining to students that history is not simply what happened, but the argument about what it means. He had been, she thought, with a specific ache of love expressed in the form of a problem very like her. "I need to read the full notebooks," she said. "Take the time you need," Walt said. "Thomas isn't going anywhere. Neither am I." She hung up and went inside to read her father's notebooks from the beginning. Reading Marcus Calloway's field notebooks was not like reading a diary. It was like reading the working papers of a man who had decided to reconstruct something that had been deliberately obscured using only what he could find, verify, and connect, which was the method of a serious historical researcher. And also, she understood the method her father had always applied to anything he considered worth doing. He had been in the classroom and out of it, allergic to speculation that outran its evidence. His notebooks reflected this. Every claim was sourced, every inference was labeled as inference, every dead end was recorded alongside every breakthrough. He had begun in 2017, the summer after he retired. The first notebook covered the history of the Osage presence in this specific stretch of the valley, drawing on sources she recognized: Pike Sibley, the federal land records, and sources she hadn't known he had access to, a collection of Osage oral tradition accounts that Thomas Red Cloud at the Cultural Center had shared with him, with the explicit understanding that Marcus was not writing for publication without permission. He had recorded this understanding on the first page of the notebook in capital letters, underlined twice. "Nothing in this work is for publication without approval from Osage Nation." He had meant it. She could see in the years of notes that followed that he had always approached Thomas as a collaborator, rather than a source asking questions, yes, but also reporting back his findings for correction, incorporating objections, revising his interpretations when Thomas told him he'd gotten something wrong. That, she thought, was the difference between a historian and an antiquarian. An antiquarian collected. A historian understood that history belongs to the people who lived it and that telling it requires their participation. She read for 3 hours. By the end of the second notebook, she had a clear picture of what her father had built: a meticulous, rigorously sourced argument that the section of the Osage River Valley between Shell City and the Brashear Ford had been a significant and continuous habitation area for the Osage people from at least 1780 through the forced removal of 1825, and that the specific landform adjacent to the cabin, the elevated east bank with its spring access and south exposure, and the sheltered tributary that ran dry in August, but ran full and cold all winter, matched in every material particular the description that George Sibley had recorded of the main winter village. The significance was not merely academic. If the site could be formally identified and recognized, it changed the legal and cultural conversation about what lay beneath the modern footprint of the valley, what the Corps of Engineers reservoir had flooded, what the post-war development had built over what the state of Missouri had for generations managed without acknowledgement. Her father had not been naive about the obstacles. He had noted them systematically in the margins of his notes: the resistance of the State Archaeological Survey, which had a bureaucratic interest in not reopening questions about sites beneath Corps of Engineers projects; the broader political difficulty of any process that required state acknowledgement of removal-era dispossession; the legal complexity of the Osage Nation's territorial claims, which were real and ongoing, and not going to be settled by a retired high school teacher's field notebooks, however meticulous. But he had also noted, with the quiet stubbornness she recognized as his most characteristic quality, these obstacles are not arguments against the project. They are arguments for doing it more carefully. She had been a history teacher for 31 years. She had sent students to state competitions and college scholarships in graduate programs. She had argued in classroom after classroom that history had present consequences, that the past was not over, that the obligation of a person who understands what happened is to make sure other people understand it too. She had apparently been training for this without knowing it. She called Thomas Red Cloud on Saturday. He answered on the second ring in the measured, careful voice of a man who has learned to be measured and careful in conversations with non-Osage researchers, a caution Nora recognized immediately and respected. "I'm Nora Calloway," she said, "Marcus's daughter. I'm at the cabin. I've read the notebooks." A pause. "He said you'd come," Thomas said. He said you'd need time to get there. He wasn't sure how long. 3 years, she said. I'm a slow starter. Something in his voice shifted, not quite warmth, but the careful withdrawal of wariness. He said you were direct. He said you were patient. She paused. I need both if we're going to finish what he started. A longer pause. She had learned from years of teaching students who needed time to formulate a genuine response rather than a reflexive one, to be comfortable with the particular silence of someone thinking rather than stalling. The Winter Village site, Thomas said. He was close. The landform markers matched the oral tradition accounts from the early reservation period. There are 3 families whose histories reference that exact configuration of spring and riverbank and hill exposure. That's not coincidence. That's memory. I understand. The State Archaeological Survey. I read his notes, she said. I know the history with the survey. She paused. I'm not a state agency. I'm a retired history teacher with 31 years of working with primary sources, a meticulous set of research notebooks, and a clear sense of what an argument needs to accomplish and who needs to be convinced. Another pause. And I'm in the right place. Thomas was quiet for a moment. What does that mean? It means I'm at the cabin, she said. On the property. I intend to be here for the summer. I have the maps and the notebooks and the correspondence files and whatever else was in that box. And I have time for the first time in 31 years to do one thing properly instead of 30 things adequately. She could hear in the quality of his quiet that he was making a decision. I'll drive up next week, he said. Wednesday, I want to see the field maps and walk the property. I'll make coffee, she said. And I should tell you, there's a retired hydrological engineer named Walt Briggs who lives up the hill and spent 30 years with the Corps working this river. He knew my father. He's part of this too, if you're willing. A pause. Walt Briggs, Thomas said. The name had weight in his voice, recognition, and something more complex than simple recognition. He testified at the Truman Dam environmental hearings in 1969. He was the only Corps engineer who told the committee the reservoir would flood 17 known cultural sites. He was right. They built it anyway. He told me he was 26 when he started on that project, Nora said, and that he was not old enough to understand what he was helping to build. Some people spend the rest of their lives trying to account for that, Thomas said. I think he's been trying, she said. Another pause. Wednesday, Thomas said. I'll be there by 10. Claire called on Sunday with the particular careful energy of someone who has been sitting on something for 4 days. Dad called me, she said. Nora set her coffee down. Daniel. Of course. Claire's parents had been divorced for 9 years amicably, or at least in the specific way that divorce becomes amicable, when both parties have accepted that the other person is not wrong, merely incompatible, and they maintained a cordial relationship that occasionally synchronized around concern for their daughter, which always ran the risk of feeling like a coordinated campaign. What did he say? Nora asked. He's worried. He said you're isolating. I'm at my father's cabin. He said you're avoiding your real problem by going somewhere remote and doing practical tasks. Nora considered this for a moment with genuine honesty, the way she had always tried to consider criticism not defensively, but as a hypothesis worth examining. She had spent 31 years teaching students to steel men, an opposing argument before dismissing it, and she applied the same standard to her own life with the consistency of someone who believes that intellectual honesty has to be total to be useful. Was she avoiding? She looked at the work table where her father's notebooks were spread open. She thought about Thomas Red Cloud and the Wednesday appointment and the unfinished map at the bottom of the box. She thought about Walt footing the ladder and the chainsaw cuts and the chicken and dumplings and the conversation about Truman Dam in the 1969 hearings, and what it meant to spend 50 years trying to account for something you'd done at 26. No, she said. Mom. Daniel is applying his framework to my situation, she said without anger. His framework is that meaningful professional life requires institutional affiliation, and that leaving mine without a replacement constitutes crisis. That framework works for Daniel. It does not work for everyone, and it has never worked for me. She paused. I am not isolating. I am working on a project. I have 2 collaborators and more primary sources than I've had access to in 30 years. I am doing, Claire, the exact thing I have always done. I am teaching history. The setting is different. A long silence. What project? Claire said. Nora told her. She told her about the box and the notebooks and the maps and Thomas Red Cloud and the Osage Winter Village site and what her father had been building and what he hadn't had time to finish. She told her about Walt and the 1969 hearings and the 17 cultural sites the reservoir had flooded. She told her about the obligation of a person who understands what happened to make sure other people understand it too. She told her all of it because Claire was her daughter and was owed the truth, and because Nora had spent 31 years arguing that the worst thing a person can do with history is keep it private. When she finished, there was a long silence of a different quality than the ones before. Not anxious, something else. Mom, Claire said finally, Grandpa left you that work on purpose. I know. He knew you'd come eventually. He thought I'd need time, she paused. He was right. Another silence. Then, I didn't know he was doing any of this. Neither did I. She looked at the map spread open on the table, the last one, the unfinished one, the penciled marks waiting to become ink. That's the thing about people you think you know completely. There's always more. Claire was quiet for a moment. I want to see the notebooks, she said, when you're ready for company. Nora felt something warm move through her chest. Not relief exactly, she had not been worried she had been busy, but the particular pleasure of a door opening that you were glad to find unlocked. Give me a few weeks, she said. Come in June. Bring your wellies. The bank gets muddy in the morning. Wellies, Claire repeated in the tone of a woman from St. Louis who has not owned rubber boots since approximately 1997. Buy some, Nora said. This is field work. She spent the rest of Sunday afternoon on the porch with the third notebook, the half-finished one, the last one reading slowly. The final entries charted her father's growing certainty about the Winter Village site. He had walked the property a dozen times in the last 2 years of his life, marking and remarking the landform features with the systematic precision of someone who knows that physical evidence disappears and written record is the only permanence. He had taken photographs. The box contained a manila envelope of prints, each labeled on the back in his handwriting, with coordinates and date and what he was documenting. He had measured the spring flow in 4 seasons and compared it to Sibley's description of the water source the Osage had depended on. He had been building a case, not just an academic argument, a case. The kind of argument that could be taken to a court or a legislature or a federal agency or the broader public and could survive the scrutiny of people who had reasons to want it to fail. He had understood in the specific way that a history teacher understands things, that the difference between evidence and a persuasive argument is the work of framing it for the audience that needs to be convinced. He had left that work for her. The last entry, dated June 3rd, 2021, was brief. 3 sentences. Walk this morning along the North Tributary. The spring is running clean and cold. This is the place. She sat with the notebook in her lap and the river below, and the May afternoon going amber around the sycamores, and she thought about her father walking the tributary on a morning 3 weeks before he died, standing beside the spring that had run through this valley since before the first European expedition had ever heard of the Osage River, and writing 3 sentences that were for a man who weighed every word the equivalent of a declaration. This is the place. She had always known her father was a man who paid attention. She was only now understanding the full scope of what he'd been paying attention to. She closed the notebook. She would read it again tomorrow more carefully. She would go through all the source citations and check the archives and build a proper research bibliography of her own. She would prepare for Wednesday when Thomas Red Cloud came, because Thomas coming was not a casual visit, it was a professional consultation, and she intended to be prepared. She had spent 31 years being prepared. That habit was not going to abandon her simply because the building had changed. She made supper eggs and toast, the unambitious meal of a person whose mind is elsewhere, and ate on the porch with the evening coming down the valley and the nighthawks beginning their erratic, purposeful patrol over the water. Her father had loved nighthawks. He had spent one entire summer when she was 12 recording their hunting patterns over this stretch of river, filling a notebook she had thought at 12 was a somewhat excessive response to a bird. She understood now that it had not been excessive at all. It had been exactly the right response to a world that rewarded attention. She was 58 years old. She had resigned from a job that no longer fit. She was at her father's cabin on a river she'd been afraid of since she was 7 years old, in possession of 4 years of meticulous research she had not known existed, with a Wednesday appointment with a man from the Osage Nation Cultural Center and a retired Corps engineer who had been trying to account for something since 1969. She was not done. She was in fact just beginning. The nighthawks worked the river below her in the last light, and she sat and watched them the way her father had taught her to watch completely, without the need to be doing something else. And she thought, yes, this is the place. End of part 2. Wednesday arrived with low cloud and the smell of rain held off, which was the best kind of weather for field work. Cool and diffuse the light even, and clear the kind of morning that doesn't ask anything of you before you've had your coffee. Nora had been up since 5:30. She had reorganized the research materials on the work table into a proper working arrangement. The 14 maps laid out in sequence by river section, the source citation index printed in 2 copies, the photographs sorted by date and location in labeled envelopes, the notebooks stacked with index page markers at the key passages. She had made a timeline, the kind she used to put on the board for her AP students running from 1719 to 2021, charting what the documentary records showed at each point about the Osage presence in this valley and what had happened to it. She had also made a list of what the research did not yet establish, because a case is only as strong as your understanding of its weaknesses, and she was not going to walk into a meeting with Thomas Red Cloud without knowing exactly where the gaps were. Walt arrived at 9:45 in the faded F-150. He came to the porch, looked at the organized work table through the window, and said nothing which she had learned to read as approval. "He'll want to walk the property first," Walt said, "before we talk documents." I expected that, the tributary especially. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left out with the easy familiarity of someone who has been invited into a kitchen enough times to know where the cups are. There's a section about 200 yards upstream where the spring comes out of the limestone. Your father called it the confirmation point. The oral tradition accounts describe it specifically. The Sibley notes describe it too, she said. Spring flowing from stone at the head of the tributary northeast of the main winter habitation. He said the Osage called it, she checked her notes, the water that remembers. Walt was quiet for a moment. I didn't know that. It's in the Cultural Center correspondence. Letter from Thomas, February 2020. My father underlined it twice. A long pause. Outside, the sycamores moved in a small wind off the river. The water that remembers, Walt said in the tone of a man encountering something that reorganizes something else. The river has its own memory, Nora said. That's what my father was trying to document. Not just that the Osage were here, that's not in dispute or shouldn't be, but precisely how they were here and why this specific geography and what that means for understanding what was lost when it was taken. Walt drank his coffee. He was a man who absorbed things without rushing to respond to them. She had noticed this in the first hour she'd known him and had come to consider it one of his most reliable qualities. Marcus used to say, Walt said slowly that the worst thing about the reservoir was not the water. It was that it convinced people there was nothing there before. That you can flood a history and make it look like there was no history to flood. He wrote that in the 3rd notebook, she said. He said it to me first, in a letter, 2018. Walt set down his cup. He was angrier about it than he let himself write. He was a careful man about anger, she said. He thought it was only useful when it was organized. He was right about that. Thomas Red Cloud arrived at 10:02 in a silver Camry, which he parked beside the F-150, with the unhurried economy of motion that characterized everything else about him, compact, deliberate, wasting nothing. He was in his mid-50s, Nora guessed, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent a career navigating institutions that require you to be exceptionally precise in order to be taken seriously at all. He wore field clothes, canvas pants, waterproof boots, a plain work jacket, and he carried a leather portfolio under his arm. He looked at the cabin, then at the river, then at Nora. He described you well, he said. He described you the same way. She extended her hand. Nora Calloway. This is Walt Briggs. The two men looked at each other with the specific weight of people who know each other's history without having met. 1969, Thomas said. I've been accounting for it since, Walt said. Thomas looked at him for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man who has heard that sentence or versions of it from many people over many years and has learned to distinguish between the people for whom it is performance and the people for whom it is the organizing fact of their working life. He appeared to conclude something. Let's walk the property, he said. They walked north along the bank. First Nora with her father's map in hand, Thomas with his portfolio. Walt moving through the terrain with the familiarity of someone who has walked it in the context of water systems rather than history and is now rereading it in a different language. At the tributary, they turned east. The stream was running high from the week's rain, clear cold over limestone shelf rock. The banks on either side hung with fern and water willow. 200 yards in the valley narrowed, and the limestone came up through the soil on the north bank, and the spring emerged from a fissure in the rock face in a clean, cold, continuous thread. Thomas stood at the spring for a long time. He didn't speak. He looked at the rock face, at the water emerging, at the specific configuration of exposed limestone and the overhanging red cedar in the south-facing slope across the tributary. He opened his portfolio and consulted something she could not see what, and he looked again. The oral tradition accounts, he said without looking away from the spring, from 3 different families' histories. They all describe a water source with this exact relationship to the hillside. Red rock, cedar overhang, the way the water comes out of the stone. My father called it the confirmation point, Nora said. He was right. Thomas touched the rock face with one hand briefly with a care that was not theatrical. The families who came here before removal, their descendants remember this, not as history, as home. Walt stood a few feet back, looking at the spring with the expression of a man doing the kind of accounting that has no clean resolution. Nora had learned in a week to read his silences as carefully as his words. The reservoir, she said to Thomas, 4 miles south. If the habitation area was continuous along this stretch, it was. He closed the portfolio. The winter site your father mapped here and at least 2 summer dispersal sites downstream under 30 feet of water since 1964. He looked at the spring. We know where they are. We can't reach them. We can document them, argue for their significance, push for formal recognition. But the water has them. Which is why this site, Nora said, this section is intact, undisturbed. Because it's private land, Walt said. He had been quiet for several minutes. Your grandfather's land. Your father's. Yours now. She had not thought about it in those terms until this moment. The luck of it, the specific luck of private ownership, maintaining the integrity of a landform that would otherwise have been subdivided or developed or simply altered beyond recognition by the ordinary indifference of people who don't know what's there. My grandfather built the cabin here in the 1940s, she said. He didn't know. He chose well, Thomas said with something in his voice that was not quite irony, but acknowledged the complicated nature of that luck. Your father knew, and your father chose to tell us. He looked at her directly. The question now is what we do with the knowing. Nora looked at the spring, the water coming out of the limestone in its steady cold thread, the same water that had emerged from the same place every day, for how many thousands of years, indifferent to everything that had happened at its margins, simply running, because that was its nature, and its nature did not require an audience. We write the argument, she said, the full argument. My father built the evidentiary foundation. What it needs now is the interpretation. The framing, the case that goes to the State Archaeological Survey and the federal review process and eventually to the public. She paused. That's what a history teacher does. Thomas looked at her for a moment. It will take time, he said. I have time, she said. For the first time in 31 years, I have exactly this one thing to do. He looked at the spring again, then at her. All right, he said. They walked back to the cabin. Nora made fresh coffee. They spread the maps on the work table and they got to work. End of part 2 extended. The work settled into a rhythm over the following 10 days. Thomas drove up from the cultural center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Walt came down from the hill most mornings early and contributed the thing that neither Nora nor Thomas had by themselves, a hydrologist's understanding of how the river had moved and changed over 200 years, and what that change meant for interpreting the physical landscape as evidence. He had spent his career modeling river behavior, tracking sediment loads, calculating erosion rates. He could look at a cut bank and tell you what decade had shaped it. He could look at a gravel bar and estimate how long it had been there. His knowledge was not the knowledge of history, it was the knowledge of the physical world that history had occurred in, which turned out to be essential in ways Nora had not anticipated. You two together are essentially your father, Thomas told her one afternoon after Walt had spent 40 minutes walking through the hydraulic evidence for the location of the original main channel, which had shifted 3 times in the last 200 years, and whose earlier positions explained why Sibley's description of the approach to the winter village from the water had confused every researcher who tried to match it to the modern river. He didn't have Walt's technical knowledge. He was compensating with a lot of very careful measurement. He would have found this eventually, Nora said. Probably. Thomas looked at the map Walt had been annotating. This is faster. Nora built the written argument the way she had always built a historical analysis claim: evidence interpretation, acknowledgement of counter-argument response. She wrote clearly and precisely, and she did not write more than the argument required because she had spent 31 years teaching students that the persuasive power of a historical argument is inversely proportional to its length when the length is padded rather than earned. She made the case for the Winter Village site in 23 pages that she could defend in front of any committee or review board in the state of Missouri. Thomas read the draft on a Thursday afternoon sitting at the work table while Nora made coffee. He read it 3 times. She noted that he read it 3 times. She had learned in 3 decades of classroom teaching that when a serious reader reads something 3 times without speaking, either something is significantly wrong or significantly right. "This is good," he said finally. "This is very good." A pause. "You cite the oral tradition accounts correctly as corroboration rather than primary evidence in the Western legal sense, but with a note to the fact that from the Osage perspective, oral tradition is the primary evidence and the written documents are the corroboration. That framing was in your February 2020 letter," she said. "To my father. I thought you'd said it better than I could." He looked at her for a moment. "You're giving me authorship credit." "Collaborative research has collaborative authorship," she said. "That's not generosity, it's accurate." He was quiet for a moment. "Then Marcus raised you well." "He taught history for 30 years, she said. "He taught it the right way. Some of it got into the furniture." The second flood came without warning. That was the thing she would say later to Claire, to Thomas, to anyone who asked. It came without warning. Not because it was impossible to predict. Walt, when she told him afterwards, said he had seen the pressure system on the 3-day satellite map and had been about to call her, but because the warning came too late, which in a practical sense was indistinguishable from no warning at all. It was the 3rd week of May, 11 days after the first flood. The river had recovered to its spring baseline. The research was going well. She had been at the work table until 11 the previous night, working through the Federal Land Survey records from 1821, cross-referencing her father's citations against the digitized originals, and she had gone to bed feeling the specific satisfaction of productive work, the kind of tiredness that has earned itself. She woke at 2:15 in the morning to silence. Not the silence of a house, the silence of a world holding its breath. The river sound was gone. She had grown up with Marcus Calloway explaining with the earnest attention he applied to everything worth knowing, that when a river goes quiet upstream, it means one of 2 things. Either the flow has been interrupted by something lodged in the channel, or the headwaters have been hit by a rainfall so heavy and so fast that the channel is still receiving the slug of water, and the sound ahead of it hasn't arrived yet. Either way, he had said, when the river goes quiet, you go to the window. She went to the window. She couldn't see the river in the dark, but she could see in the ambient light of a 3/4 moon that the bank had already changed shape. The gravel bar that extended into the channel from the south was submerged. The willow at the water's edge was standing in 3 feet of water that had not been there 6 hours ago. She pulled on her clothes and her rain jacket and her boots, and she went outside with the flashlight. She drove the reference peg at the high water mark she had established after the first flood and read the current level 22 inches above her May baseline. Rising. She looked at the north wall of the cabin, the 1993 mark at 51 inches. She had 29 inches of margin. In the first flood, the peak had reached 42 inches. But the first flood had come with rain she could hear in a 3-day buildup in a weather radio warning. This one had arrived in darkness and silence, which meant it was moving faster, which meant the headwater slug was larger. She called Walt. He answered on the first ring, which meant he was already awake. "I see it," he said. "The NWS just pushed an emergency alert. Flash flood. The Whitmans Creek tributary 8 miles north. It took 11 inches of rain in 4 hours. I'm getting in the truck." "Walt, I'll be there in 7 minutes." She hung up and made a decision. Not in the way of movies, not dramatically, not with a speech, just quickly with the clarity of someone who has been trained by 31 years of managing high-stakes situations without the luxury of losing her composure. The research. The 14 maps were on the work table. The notebooks were stacked beside them. The source files, 4 years of her father's work, her own past 3 weeks of work, were in 3 accordion files on the shelf. The photographs were in the manila envelope. She pulled the 2 largest plastic storage bins from the shed. She lined them with the contractor garbage bags from under the sink. She packed the maps flat in the first bin, the notebooks and files, in the second, the photographs between layers of paper towel. She sealed both bins with their lids and 2 wraps of duct tape per seam. She carried them to the truck, not her truck, which was parked at the low point of the yard, and put them in the bed of the Subaru, which sat on higher ground near the porch. 29 minutes. Walt arrived at 2:48. He came down the gravel road in the F-150 with his headlights cutting through the tree line, and Nora had already moved everything she intended to move. She was at the reference peg when he pulled up. She read him the number 31 inches. He got out and looked at the river. In the 7 minutes since she'd last checked, the surface had changed character. The clear running water she had known for 3 weeks was gone. In its place, the copper-colored floodwater of the upper valley, turbid and fast-carrying debris. She could hear more than see the clatter and knock of wood against wood, the hiss of suspended sediment. Upstream, something large, a tree trunk or a section of bank, had come loose and was working down the channel with the unstoppable patience of something that has been waiting for enough water and now has it. "This is bigger than the first one," she said, significantly. He was watching the surface the way he had spent a career watching water, without drama, with complete attention. "Whitman's Creek floods fast and drops fast. Peak will come in the next 2 hours. The question is how high it peaks." She looked at the north wall. 51 inches to the mark, she said. "I'm at 31, I have 20 inches. 11 inches of rain on a saturated watershed." He did math she couldn't follow quickly, the way engineers do, not visibly, just the pause in the answer. "It'll be close." She thought about this with the precision of someone who is frightened and knows that fear is only useful when it is organized. She was afraid. She acknowledged it. She did not permit it to do anything except sharpen her attention. "What do I move?" she said. "What's already in the truck?" "Research materials, maps and notebooks, everything irreplaceable." He looked at her. In the moonlight, she could see the expression that she had come to recognize as his version of respect, not performed, not spoken, just there in the steadiness of his gaze. "Then we prepare the cabin," he said, "and we wait." The preparation took 40 minutes. They moved everything off the floor onto the table and shelves. There was not much. She had lived simply and had left the cabin uncluttered, which was the first piece of luck. Walt muscled the wood stove surround up onto the fireplace shelf, which required considerable strength and a creative use of a section of the old porch railing as a lever. She cleared the kitchen cabinets to the upper shelves and secured the lower cabinet doors with bungee cord from the supply shed. She packed her personal essentials, laptop, medications, the small case of documents from St. Louis that included her resignation letter and her father's death certificate and the deed to the property, into the waterproof dry bag she had found in her father's closet, and which she now understood he had owned for exactly this eventuality. She had stopped being afraid somewhere around the wood stove, not because the fear had resolved. The river was continuing to rise and the sounds it was making were not small sounds, but because she was occupied. She had noticed this about herself before in minor crises of the teaching kind. The fear did not leave it transformed. It became the fuel for the doing, and the doing used it up. Walt was competent in a flood, in the way she was competent in a classroom, that complete unself-conscious ease that comes from having done the thing enough times that your body knows it independently of your mind. He knew where the water would come first, where it would pool, what it would damage, and what it would not. He had spent 30 years working with water in the systems far more complex than a river cabin on the Osage, and his knowledge of water's behavior, its patience, its preference for low ground, its tendency to find the weakness in any structure, was thorough and completely calm. She matched his calm with her own, not because she manufactured it, but because calmness in a competent colleague is, she had always found, the most reliable antidote to unnecessary fear. He was not afraid. But therefore, the situation, while serious, was manageable. She held on to that logic and worked. At 3:40, Walt read the reference peg, 43 inches. The 1993 mark was 8 inches away. "This is where it was in 93, she asked. "Close." He was watching the surface. The current had become genuinely powerful. Now she could see it in the way the surface moved. Not the easy ripple of normal flow, but the driven urgency of water under pressure, organized and purposeful. The 1993 flood was the result of 6 days of rain on already saturated ground. This is a pulse flood, short duration, high peak, fast recession, different shape. meaning the peak is closer, meaning the peak should come in the next 40 minutes. And then the recession begins. He looked at her. Pulse floods drop fast. The 1993 mark was a 6-day event. This one shouldn't reach it. Should, she said. Should, he agreed. He did not soften things with false certainty, and she respected him for it. They stood on the porch, which was now surrounded by a thin layer of water. The yard entirely submerged, the sycamores standing in 3 inches of moving river. And she thought about the cabin around her, the structure her grandfather had built in the 1940s, and her father had added to, and which had held through every flood since including 1993. She thought about the research in the truck, her father's work, and her own sealed-in bins on higher ground. She thought about Walt standing beside her with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who has looked at a great many bodies of water at inconvenient moments and found them manageable. She was not afraid. She was cold, and she was alert, and she was watching the peg. Your father, Walt said, out of the particular silence that people fall into when they are waiting for something they cannot hurry, was here during the 1993 flood. I didn't know that. He called me afterward. We had been corresponding about the Truman Dam for 2 years by then. He described the flood. A pause. He said, standing here in the water watching the river do what it has always done, it becomes very difficult to pretend that human decisions about this river are permanent. The river doesn't know about Truman Dam. It just keeps doing what it was doing before the dam existed. She looked at the moving water around the porch steps. He said that to you. In a letter, I still have it. He watched the peg. Your father wrote very good letters. He was a careful man about words, she said. He was careful about everything that mattered. Walt was quiet for a moment. The research he left you, he worked on it every summer for 4 years. He drove 3 hours each way from Jefferson City. He corresponded with Thomas every month. He built something that had no institutional support and no guarantee of recognition and no professional audience because he thought it needed to exist. Another pause. That is a particular kind of courage. Not dramatic, just steady. Nora looked at the reference peg. She looked at the river. She looked at the north wall of the cabin and the faded blue mark, 4 feet 3 inches from the foundation, that her grandfather had made in 1993, which the river was approaching and had not yet reached. He was always steady, she said. I didn't always understand how much that cost him. It costs more when nobody sees it, Walt said. She stood beside the man who had spent 50 years accounting for a decision he'd made at 26 on the porch of a cabin her grandfather had built before she was born, watching a river her father had loved past the point of reason and had spent his last years trying to make matter to people who had not yet understood that it should. She understood in this moment what she was doing here. Not abstractly, she had understood it abstractly for days, but in the complete embodied way that understanding becomes permanent. She was here because steadiness is inherited, not automatically, not without effort. But if you pay attention, if you choose to, it passes. The river peaked at 4:07 in the morning, 49 inches, 2 inches below the 1993 mark. She read the peg herself twice with the flashlight crouching at the cabin's northeast corner, with the water swirling cold around the top of her boots. 49, she said. Walt let out a single breath. Peak, he said. They waited 15 minutes without speaking. At 4:22, the peg read 48. The river was falling. Dawn came gradually the way Ozark dawns, come not an event, but a slow revision of darkness, the blue-gray lifting through the sycamore canopy until the shapes of things were visible, and then the colors, and then the full complicated fact of what the flood had left behind. The yard held 6 inches of standing water. The lower 3 steps of the porch were submerged. The shed had taken on some water at the door threshold. She could see the water line inside, but the stored materials were on shelves and had not been reached. The cabin floor was dry, not damp, not stain dry. The foundation had held, and the elevated construction had done what elevated construction is designed to do. She stood on the porch in the morning light and looked at the river, which was still running high and copper-colored and fast, but had withdrawn from the yard and was back within the general territory of its own channel. Walt was in the kitchen making coffee. She had not asked him to. He had simply gone inside and done it, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done and exactly what she needed. She brought the research bins in from the truck and opened them on the work table. The maps were dry. The notebooks were dry. The photographs were dry. She stood there for a moment looking at the intact materials her father's 4 years And her 3 weeks, in the 14 maps, in the annotated notebooks, in Thomas Red Cloud's correspondence, and all the rest of it, and she felt something she could not name precisely, something at the intersection of relief and resolve, and the specific emotion of having been tested and not broken. Walt came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table beside her. He looked at the bins. "All good," he said. "All good." She picked up her cup. "You knew the cabin would hold." "I thought it would hold." He drank his coffee. "I've been wrong about water before. That's the thing about water. It has the final opinion." She nodded. Through the window, the river moved in its lowering course, copper, going slowly to brown, going slowly to the clearer tones that would, by afternoon, be something close to its ordinary self. "Walt," she said. "Your father built that corner the same way." He turned to look at her. "That's what you said," she said, "when I first asked you to foot the ladder, about the roof repair. You said your father built things a particular way, and my grandfather built the same way." She looked at him. "You've been watching this cabin for a long time." He was quiet. "My father left it in your view on purpose," she said. "Didn't he?" A long pause. Walt looked out the window at the river. When he looked back at her, something in his face had the quality of something that has been waiting to be said and has found the right moment. "He wrote to me in 2018, he said. He said, I am an old man doing research that I will not be able to finish. My daughter is a history teacher. She doesn't know what I'm working on, and I am not ready to tell her, and by the time I am ready, she may be in a different place in her life. I need someone to watch the property. I need someone who will know if she comes." He trusted me with the access code to the supply shed. Nora held her coffee in both hands. "He thought you'd come before he died," Walt said. "He wanted to tell you himself. He ran out of time." He looked at the work table. "But he also believed that if you came after when you were ready, you would find it, and you would understand it, because you're a history teacher, and history teachers understand that the document is worth nothing if nobody reads it." She sat down at the work table. The maps lay flat before her, her father's careful drafting hand in every line. "He was right," she said. "He usually was." She looked at the unfinished map, the last one, the one that covered the property, the penciled marks waiting to become ink. She picked up her father's mechanical pencil from the supply cup beside the table. She had been using it for 2 weeks reflexively, in the way you reach for a familiar tool. It was a Pentel P205, the same model she had used in grad school and in her classroom, and that her father had apparently used for the last decade of his research. She looked at the map. She found the notation for the spring, the confirmation point, the water that remembers, and she checked the reference coordinates against the survey. She inked it in. She went back to work. End of part 3. Thomas came on Thursday, 2 days after the second flood. He drove through the still muddy gravel road and parked and looked at the debris line on the porch steps. The high water mark of 2 nights ago already drying to a faint gray stain, and said, "You stayed." "I stayed," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing attention she had come to expect from him. "The research. Moved to the truck before it peaked, dry." She opened the door. "Come look at the map." He came in. He saw the last map on the work table, the unfinished one, the pencil marks that were now partially inked, the confirmation point notation drawn in her father's mechanical pencil, but in her hand. He stood and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "You finished the spring notation," he said. "I verified the coordinates first, 3 times." She paused. "I used his pencil, the same model." Thomas looked at the map for another moment. Then, he would have done it exactly that way. He pulled out his portfolio. "I drove up because I have something to show you." He laid 3 photographs on the table beside the map. They were black and white archival prints, so careful the kind of photographs that had been made with a specific intention of being permanent. The first showed a section of riverbank. The second showed a limestone spring emerging from a rock face. The third showed a cleared area on an elevated bank with 2 structures visible low and long. "These are from the Osage Nation Cultural Center archives," Thomas said. "Taken in 1921 by a government surveyor documenting land use patterns in advance of the federal allotment process. The surveyor was documenting what he intended to eliminate." He paused. "The limestone spring in the second photograph." She looked at it. The configuration of rock and cedar overhang and spring emergence was unmistakable. She had stood at that spring 3 weeks ago and 2 weeks ago and last week, and she knew its specific geometry the way she knew the specific geometry of things she had paid close attention to. This is our spring, she said. Yes. He pointed to the cleared area in the third photograph. And this is the winter habitation site. As of 1921, it was still being used. Not continuously by then, after removal and the allotment era intermittently, but used. His finger traced the edge of the elevated bank, which means it was not simply a pre-removal historical site. It was an active use site as recently as 100 years ago. Nora understood immediately what this meant for the argument. She could feel the structure of it rearranging the stronger foundation, the additional evidentiary tier, the way a case that had been solid became persuasive. This changes the federal review threshold, she said. An active use site within living memory isn't just an archaeological question. It triggers different protections. Different review requirements, Thomas said, which the State Archaeological Survey cannot unilaterally set aside. He looked at her. Your father did not have these photographs. I found them 6 weeks ago while pulling the archival material for the federal review response. I have been waiting for the right moment to share them. This is the right moment, she said. We file by the end of the month. Can you have the written argument revised by then? I can have it revised by Monday, she said. Walt, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway sometime during this exchange with 3 cups of coffee, set them on the work table without comment. He picked up the 1921 photograph of the spring and looked at it for a long time. 90 years before it should have been documented, he said. 100 years before anyone asked the right people the right questions, Thomas said. There was no particular bitterness in his voice. It was a statement of fact with the weight that facts carry when they have been waited for too long. Walt set the photograph down precisely where he had picked it up from. It's being documented now, he said. You just thinking. Claire arrived on the third Saturday of May, 2 days earlier than planned, in a rented car from Springfield, because she said, when she called from the highway, been unable to talk herself into waiting any longer. She pulled into the yard in the late afternoon and stood beside the car and looked at the cabin and the sycamores and the river. And her expression had the quality of someone encountering a place they have been hearing about their entire life without understanding it until now. Nora came down the porch steps. Claire was in rubber boots, new ones stiff and bright green, clearly purchased in the last week, in a rain jacket, in the expression of a woman who has decided something and arrived to execute it. I bought wellies, she said. I see that. They're uncomfortable. They'll break in. Nora looked at her daughter, the dark hair and the Thomas eyes and the spine that was hers, which had always given her a complicated feeling, the pride mixed with the recognition of something that had once been smaller. Come inside. I have things to show you. Claire stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at the work table, the maps spread across it, the notebooks, the 1921 photographs pinned to the board above the table, the typed argument in its latest revised draft, the index cards and sticky notes, and the general organized density of serious ongoing work. She looked at it for a long time. Mom, she said, you've been doing this for 3 weeks, 22 days. This is a real research project. It was always a real research project, Nora said. Your grandfather built it. I'm finishing it. Claire walked to the table. She picked up one of the maps, the third one in the sequence, the section of river that included the spring, and looked at it with the careful attention that Nora had always thought of as her daughter's best quality. Claire did not skim. She had always read everything completely before she formed an opinion, a trait that had made her a disciplined student and an excellent hospital administrator, and occasionally a slow decision-maker, though Nora had always thought that was a feature rather than a bug. Grandpa drew these, Claire said, by hand, over 4 summers. Nora stood beside her. The spring notation on this one is mine, but everything else is his. Claire looked at the notation. The small, precise symbol her mother had inked in 3 weeks ago matched to her grandfather's style as closely as she could manage. She looked at the mechanical pencil on the table. His pencil, she said. His model. Nora paused. Same one I used in grad school. He apparently liked it too. Claire set the map down carefully. She looked at her mother with an expression that Nora could read, but could not have described something between the acknowledgement of having been wrong about a thing and the specific feeling of being glad to have been wrong. I told Dad you were isolating, she said. I know. I was wrong. Yes. Nora kept her voice even without the edge that this particular conversation could have had but didn't need to. You were worried. That's not a flaw, Claire. It's love without full information. You said that on the phone about yourself, the way you'd gone to the cabin without telling me about the project. Because I didn't know about the project yet. She picked up the third notebook, the half-finished one, Marcus's last. Here, she handed it to her daughter. Start with the last entry. Claire opened the notebook to the final page. She read the 3 sentences Marcus had written on June 3rd, 2021. Walk this morning along the North Tributary. The spring is running clean and cold. This is the place. She was quiet for a long moment. He was here 3 weeks before he died, she said, and he knew it was worth something. He just hadn't found the way to say it to me yet. Nora looked at the work table. He left it here instead, for when I was ready. Claire closed the notebook. She looked at the river through the window, the evening light on the water, the heron working the far bank in its patient, unhurried way. What do you need, she said, for the project? What haven't you been able to do alone? It was such a Claire question. Not are you okay, not is this hard. What do you need? The administrative clarity that was her daughter's specific gift. Nora thought about it honestly. The Federal Review filing has a research summary requirement, she said. A plain language summary for public comment accessible to people who aren't historians. 2 pages. She paused. I write for an academic audience. I'm good at that. But plain language is a different skill. Claire looked at the drafted argument on the table. Show me the requirements, she said. I write plain language summaries for hospital policy reviews. It's not the same, but the skill is transferable. Nora spread the Federal Review guidelines on the table. They worked until 10 that night. The river moved below the window in the dark, unhurried and indifferent, and entirely itself, and the research spread across the work table in the lamplight, and the 2 Callaway women sat across from each other doing the work that needed doing, both of them careful, both of them precise, the daughter's administrative clarity, sharpening the mother's historical argument into something that did not require a graduate degree to understand. It was, Nora thought, exactly the right use of 2 people. End of part 3 complete. The night after Claire left, Nora sat alone on the porch for the first time in a week and let the quiet settle around her. It was a different quiet from the one she had arrived to find 3 weeks ago. Then the quiet had been the quiet of absence. The cabin empty, her life recently resigned, and the research undiscovered, the project not yet hers. Now the quiet had the quality of a pause in ongoing work, richer, occupied, purposeful in its stillness. She had spent 31 years in classrooms. She had spent those years learning and relearning the fundamental pedagogical truth that the teacher always learns more from the material than the student does. Not because the student is incapable, but because the teacher is required to understand the material well enough to explain it to someone who doesn't yet know it, and that requirement produces a depth of understanding that simply absorbing information cannot. She was learning this again. Every time she explained her father's research to Claire, or walked Thomas through her interpretation of a source citation, or helped Walt understand the historical significance of a landform he'd been studying, as a physical system, she understood it better herself. The argument was becoming stronger, not just because of the new evidence, Thomas's photographs, Walt's hydrological analysis, but because she was being required to know it completely enough to give it to someone else. Her father had understood this. He had taught history for 30 years. He had known that the act of explanation was the act of understanding. He had left the project for her to finish, not despite the fact that it was incomplete, because of it. She looked at the river. The water was running clear now. The sediment load had dropped over the past 2 days as the tributaries settled back to normal, and the Osage had recovered its spring character, green clear, over the gravel bars, dark and deep in the pools, the surface moving with the light intention of water that is going somewhere, but is not in a hurry. This is the place her father had written. She understood now what he had meant. Not the obvious meaning, not simply this landform, this spring, this stretch of river that the Osage had known and named and returned to for generations before removal. He had also meant she thought this is the place for the work. This is where the argument can be made from the inside by someone who stands where the history stands. She was in the right place. She had known it since the first night, but she understood it more completely now. Not because she had arrived at the cabin, but because she had arrived at the work. She stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out and the nighthawks had taken over from the swallows, and the river was invisible but fully audible, doing what it had always done, and she felt without drama, without the need for it to be anything other than what it was, that she was not beginning again after something ended. She was continuing. The difference, as any historian could tell you, matters. The Federal Review filing went in on a Tuesday. Thomas submitted it through the official channels, the Osage Nation Cultural Center, as the primary institutional applicant with Nora Callaway listed as lead researcher and Walter Briggs as technical consultant, hydrological and historical. The 23-page argument included the 14 maps, the annotated source index, the photographic evidence including the 1921 archival prints, and Claire's plain language summary, which had been after 4 drafts and a thorough disagreement about the word as significant. Exactly what the review required: clear, precise, human-scaled, and impossible to misunderstand. The State Archaeological Survey received a copy by certified mail the same morning. Nora knew that the process would be slow. She had spent 31 years explaining to students that institutional change operates on a different timescale from individual decision, and she had never been naive about the distance between filing a claim and having it acknowledged. The federal review could take 6 months. The state response could take longer. The eventual formal recognition, if it came, would require multiple hearings, additional evidentiary submissions, and the sustained attention of people with the patience and the credibility to keep the argument in front of decision-makers who had other priorities. She had patience. She had credibility. She was not going anywhere. She celebrated the filing the way she celebrated most things, quietly at her own table with good coffee and the river outside the window. Thomas drove up that evening and Walt came down from the hill, and the three of them sat on the porch in the early June warmth and drank coffee and did not particularly discuss the filing because it had been filed and that was sufficient. The work of it was done. The waiting was a different thing from the work. Your father submitted twice, Thomas said after a while, 2019 and 2021. He got form letters both times. I know. She had read the form letters in the correspondence files. They had the specific diplomatic opacity of official responses designed to acknowledge receipt without admitting receipt had any particular consequence. The 1921 photographs changed the evidentiary standing, and the joint filing from the Cultural Center is harder to categorize as amateur research. Harder, Walt said, not impossible. Harder is enough, she said. We do harder well. Walt looked at the river. It was running low now. The early June dryness beginning to tell on the Ozark tributaries, the gravel bars extending further into the channel, and the riffles gone shallow and bright. The river in this phase had a different personality than the river in flood, more exposed, more patient, showing the bones of itself. My wife is buried in the cemetery at Shell City, Walt said. It was the first time he had mentioned a wife. Nora and Thomas were both quiet. She was from Vernon County, he said. She wanted to be buried near the river. Not this exact stretch a few miles north. But she always said the Osage was home in a way that cities weren't. A pause. She would have approved of this project. She was the one who told me in 1972, 3 years after Truman Dam, that I needed to find a way to account for it. She said I couldn't carry it alone forever. He looked at the water. I didn't know how, not until Marcus wrote to me in 2018. Nora looked at him, the silver hair, the economy of motion, the 50 years of something that had finally found a place to be put down. He had a gift for finding the right person, she said. You included, Thomas said. He had said it with more gentleness than she expected, and she received it as it was meant. She called Daniel in mid-June. Not because she needed to, she had not spoken to him since before she left Jefferson City, and the absence had been clean and unremarkable. But Claire had mentioned in the way of a daughter threading carefully between two parents that Daniel had seemed genuinely curious about the project, and Nora had decided that if the project was going to go anywhere, it should go in the direction of as many informed people as possible. And Daniel, whatever else he was, had spent his career as a civil engineer and understood more than most people about federal review processes and the politics of infrastructure. He picked up on the second ring, Nora. His voice had the specific quality of someone who has been wondering whether the call would come and has decided to be gracious if it did. Claire told me about the research. I thought you should hear it from me directly, she said, so you can stop worrying. A pause. I was worried. Well, sure, and he said, I know. I was also. Claire sent me the filed argument. The 23 pages, another pause. Nora, that's a serious piece of historical research. It is. The source methodology is for a non-institutional submission. It's extremely rigorous. She thought about 31 years of teaching AP history students to cite sources correctly and was glad for a moment that it had accumulated to something. My father built the foundation, she said. I know how to construct an argument from primary sources. That's what I spent my career teaching. He knew that. Daniel's voice had shifted slightly. He knew you'd be the right person. He told me at Claire's birthday 2 years before he died, he said Nora is wasted on high school. Not an insult. He meant it the other way. He said the work she could do if she had time and a real problem. A pause. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to feel like pressure. Nora sat with this for a moment. Her father 2 years before his death talking to her ex-husband at their daughter's birthday party, saying the thing he had not yet found a way to say to her directly. She was not surprised. This was very like him. He was working up to it, she said. He ran out of time, Daniel said. I'm sorry. He left me enough. She looked at the work table, the completed last map, fully inked, now the whole series of 14 laid out in order. I'm finishing it. I know. A pause. For what it's worth, I was wrong to frame your decision as crisis. Claire told me what you said about my framework. She was right to tell me. He paused. You made the right call. This was for Daniel a significant statement. He was a man who revised his positions on evidence, but he did not do it publicly unless he meant it. Thank you, she said. That matters. What happens next, he said, with the filing? She told him about the federal review process, the state archaeological survey response, the timeline, the probable obstacles. He listened with the specific attention of an engineer, understanding a project tracking the milestones, the dependencies, the points of institutional friction. Before they hung up, he said, if you need someone to review the technical hydrology sections before the next submission round, I know a civil engineer at MU who does consulting work for the Army Corps. He could be useful. I already have one of those, she said, but I'll keep the offer. Good. A pause that was not awkward precisely, but was aware of itself. Take care of yourself, Nora. I always do, she said. That's the issue. She heard him almost laugh. It was an old joke, one of theirs from the early years when they had both been young enough to find her self-sufficiency charming rather than occasionally isolating. She had not meant to reach for it. It had simply been there the way old things are in the layer below intention. Goodbye, Daniel, she said. Goodbye, he said. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Through the window, the river ran low and bright in the afternoon light. She thought about the word goodbye, the way it had the same weight in different contexts, sometimes negligible and sometimes not. This one had been the comfortable weight of something that had finished on good terms. That was not nothing. The archaeological survey team arrived in July. Not the state team. The state team was still as of mid-June officially under review. It was a team from the University of Missouri contacted by Thomas through a colleague in the anthropology department who had been following the Osage land recognition cases and wanted to contribute qualified field assessment. There were three of them. Dr. Amelia Sato, a specialist in pre-contact Midwest archaeology. Her graduate student, a young man named Marcus. Not his legal name, but his field name, which he explained cheerfully he'd adopted from an elderly researcher he admired without yet knowing that the person he'd independently named himself after was the man whose research was the reason he was standing in this specific valley. Nora had said nothing about this coincidence. She had simply noted it in the margins of her thinking where it would stay. The third was a photographer there to document the site to professional standards. They spent 4 days on the property. Dr. Sato walked the bank and the tributary and the spring with Thomas and with Nora, and she moved through the landscape the way serious researchers move through the landscapes of their expertise reading it. She would stop at intervals and look at a landform configuration, a bench in the riverbank, a deposit of water-polished stone, the way the limestone came up through the soil, and she would say something brief and precise to her student who would record it, and then she would move on. At the spring, she stopped for a long time. She took measurements. She took photographs. She consulted Thomas on the oral tradition accounts and actually listened in the way that people who have learned to do it well listen without already knowing what they're going to say next. She asked Nora about the primary sources and read the Sibley excerpt in context and asked 3 questions that indicated she had understood the argument at a level beyond its surface. On the third day, she said to Nora, the winter habitation hypothesis is well supported. The landform evidence is consistent with everything your father documented, and the 1921 photographs confirm continuous use past the removal period. This qualifies for formal site assessment under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. She paused. That's not the state archaeological survey's call anymore. This is federal. Nora had known this theoretically since she filed the argument, But hearing it from a qualified field archaeologist who had stood at the spring and walked the property and read the sources was a different kind of knowing. My father submitted it to the state survey twice, she said. I know. Amelia Sato's voice was even but not neutral. It had the particular quality of a professional who has seen institutional indifference from the inside and has not stopped being bothered by it. He was right both times. The state simply did not have the will. She paused. The federal process is different. Not easy, not fast, but different. She looked at the spring. This site should have been formally recognized 30 years ago. We're here now. Nora stood beside the spring, the water coming out of the limestone in its steady thread, the cedar overhang above it, the south-facing slope catching the July morning light, and she thought about her father making this walk in his last June, writing 3 sentences in a half-finished notebook, leaving it for someone who would come in the right time. She had come in the right time. She thought, Marcus, you patient man, what do you need from me for the formal assessment filing? She asked. The documented argument you've already built, Amelia said, plus our field report, which I'll have ready in 3 weeks. Thomas handles the Cultural Center certification. Walt's hydrological analysis is the strongest technical component I've seen in a voluntary research submission. She paused. And I need the plain language summary you filed with the Federal Review. My daughter wrote that. Amelia looked at her. Something in her expression shifted, not surprise, but appreciation of a specific kind. Your daughter. Claire. She writes plain language summaries for hospital policy. Transferable skill. Nora looked at the spring. History is a family project. Dordon. Paul came in August. Her brother Paul from Springfield, who had called in May, with the dutiful alarm of a man who had been deployed by his niece to add his voice to the concerned chorus. He came alone. His wife was visiting grandchildren in Phoenix, driving up in his Buick on a Wednesday morning, and he sat on the porch for 2 hours while Nora explained the project, walked him through the maps, showed him the 1921 photographs. He was quiet for most of it. Paul had always been the different one, not differently intelligent, differently oriented. Where Nora and their father had bent toward the historical, the archival, the specific gravity of the documented past, Paul had bent toward the practical and the immediate. He had spent his career in insurance, and he thought in terms of risk and probability and the quantifiable future. They had always been fond of each other without quite understanding each other's language. He looked at the last map, the completed one. All 14 marks inked the winter village site delineated in the careful notation their father had developed, and Nora had continued. Dad did this, he said, over 4 summers, by himself. Mostly. Walt was a correspondent and a resource, but the physical work, the measuring, the mapping, the sourcing that was him. She paused. He didn't tell either of us. Paul was quiet for a moment. Why didn't he tell me? The question was not accusatory. It was genuine, the honest puzzlement of a man who had loved his father without always having the right language for it. I think, Nora said carefully, he didn't know how to explain it without explaining everything first. And everything was going to take a very long time. She looked at the map. He left it for the person who could finish the argument. That turned out to be me. But he loved you in a different way, the way you love the person who doesn't need the project explained to be worth knowing. Paul looked at this for a long time. That's a kind thing to say, he said. It's accurate, she said. Those are usually the same thing. He stayed for dinner. He helped her wash dishes, a thing she had not asked him to do, and which he did with the cheerful domestic willingness of someone who finds usefulness relaxing. And afterward, he sat at the table and looked at the work table spread with its research, and he said, "What can I do for the project?" She had not expected the question. She said so. "I'm a retired insurance man," he said. "I don't know anything about Osage history or river hydrology or federal review processes." He paused. "But I do know about institutional friction and prolonged claims processes and the particular art of following up on things that people would prefer to let quietly die." He looked at her. "I'm good at the follow-up." She looked at her brother, the Buick, in the Springfield house, and 30 years of insurance claims. In the same hands their father had, the wide, careful hands of Callaway men, which she had never noticed before as a category. "I'll send you the State Archaeological Survey contact information," she said. "They have been under review for 9 weeks. 9 weeks, he said in the tone of a man who has heard that particular phrase before. "They prefer the male to languish," she said. "They won't prefer it," he said pleasantly, "once I've called them 4 times. End of part 4. Walt came down from the hill the morning after Paul left. He arrived with fresh bread he baked on Tuesdays, a habit he'd maintained since his wife died 8 years ago, because she had baked on Tuesdays, and the habit had outlasted the person, and he had decided to keep it. He set the bread on the table and poured coffee and looked at the work table where the research had been reorganized again, as it was reorganized every few weeks, not because it had changed fundamentally, but because the argument kept developing and the materials needed to reflect the current state of the thinking. I heard from Thomas, he said. The Federal Review Office has requested additional technical materials, the hydrological analysis. I know, he called me yesterday. She cut the bread. It was a good loaf, dense, slightly sweet, the kind of bread that required patience to do correctly, which was characteristic. I told him you could have the expanded analysis ready by the 1st of September. Walt looked at her. You committed to my timeline without asking me. Can you have it ready by the 1st of September? A pause. Yes. Then I committed accurately. She put a slice on a plate and slid it toward him. The federal process is moving. The state is moving because Paul has now called them 6 times in 3 weeks and is, by his own description, being thorough. She paused. Dr. Sato's field report comes in next week. Walt ate his bread. He had a way of eating unhurried complete that was of a piece with everything else about him. He was a man who did not do things in halves. When do you go back? He said. She had been expecting the question. Not from Walt specifically, she had been expecting it from everyone, and they had been asking it in different ways since May. When do you go back? To Jefferson City, to the life, to the thing you were before. I'm not going back, she said. Not to that. The cabin goes on the market for rental this fall. Income, it's not enough to sit on. I'll keep Jefferson City for the winter and drive down for the fieldwork seasons. But, she stopped herself, organized what she was about to say. I have an appointment at Mizzou in September. Dr. Sato is introducing me to the history department chair. She thinks there's a possibility of an adjunct position. 1 course per semester, upper division. She paused. History of the American Midwest, specifically indigenous land use and post-contact displacement. The kind of course I always wanted to teach and couldn't in a high school curriculum. Walt was quiet for a moment. That's not retirement, he said. No, she agreed. It turns out I don't want to retire. I want to do work that's worth doing. She looked at the river. My father taught high school for 30 years and spent his retirement on the only research that mattered to him. I taught high school for 31 years and resigned to do the work I couldn't do inside the institution. She paused. We got there by different roads. Marcus would say, there's no wrong road if it gets you to the right work. He would. She drank her coffee. He'd also say something annoying about patience that I would have found more tolerable if I'd understood it earlier. Walt almost smiled, the real version, the brief one that was his equivalent of laughter. What would he say? She thought about her father in his canvas chair by the window, watching the river with the binoculars, recording what he saw in the careful hand she had been reading for 3 months. He'd say you got here, that's the thing. Everything else is commentary. Walt held his coffee cup. He'd be right, he said. The State Archaeological Survey sent an official response in the first week of September. Not a form letter, a formal response, 3 pages signed by the director, acknowledging the evidence, flagging the 1921 photographic documentation as material that had not been available in the prior submissions, and requesting a meeting with the research team in October to discuss formal site assessment. Nora read it standing at the work table at 7 in the morning, holding her coffee, and understood that what she was reading was the first institutional acknowledgement that what her father had found was real and was worth the attention of people with the authority to do something about it. She sat down. She sat for a moment in the quiet cabin with the river running outside and the fall morning coming gold through the east window and her father's map spread on the table, and she felt something that she couldn't name with precision, not triumph, which was too simple and too loud, not relief, which implied that she had doubted and she had not. Something quieter, something that had to do with the specific feeling of a thing finding its correct place after a long time of being in the wrong one. She called Thomas. I got it, she said when he picked up. A pause. Read it to me. She read him the 3 pages. He was quiet through all of it. When she finished, there was a silence of a quality she had learned to recognize, the silence of a man who has been working towards something for a long time and is now standing in front of it and needs a moment to understand that it's real. Your father submitted twice, Thomas said finally. He was right both times, she said. The river kept the record. We just needed to read it correctly. The water that remembers, Thomas said. Yes. She looked at the map, the completed last map, 14 sections of a valley's history finally documented. The water that remembers. She walked the tributary that afternoon, alone in the September light with the notebook her father had given her when she was in graduate school, a moleskin plane, the kind that could take field conditions without complaint, and his mechanical pencil in her jacket pocket. The tributary was low, but running the water clear over the limestone, the ferns on the north bank still green in the sheltered dampness. She walked it to the spring. She stood at the spring for a long time. The water came from the rock face in its steady cold thread, exactly as it always had, exactly as the Sibley account described, exactly as the 1921 photograph showed, exactly as Thomas's oral tradition accounts remembered. It had been doing this before any document existed to record it, and it would be doing it long after the last document was lost. She took out the notebook. She wrote, September. The spring is running clean and cold. Dr. Sato's field report came in this morning, supports the winter habitation hypothesis on all counts. State Survey has requested the October meeting. Thomas is driving up Friday. Walt has the expanded hydrological analysis ready. Paul called the survey director twice this week, apparently to some effect. Claire wants to come for the October meeting. I said yes. She paused, looked at the spring. We are going to finish this. Not today, not this year. These things do not finish in a single year. But the argument is built, and the evidence is documented, and the institution is for the first time required to engage with it. Dad built the foundation, and I built the argument, and Thomas and Walt, and Claire and Paul and Dr. Sato, and her student are all part of it now. That's what history does when it's done right. It doesn't stay with one person. She put the notebook in her pocket. She stood at the spring for another minute in the September light, listening to the water that had its own memory and did not need hers to keep running. Then she walked back down the tributary to the cabin. She had work to do. End of part 4 complete. The October meeting at the State Archaeological Survey was a Thursday. Nora drove to Jefferson City with Thomas in the passenger seat and Walt following in the F-150 because Thomas had requested that the full research team be present, and Walt was the full research team's technical authority on the hydrology, which was the section of the argument the survey director had specifically flagged in a follow-up letter as requiring additional expert clarification. Nora had prepared for this the way she had prepared for every significant presentation in 31 years of teaching, completely with the specific documents organized in the specific order she intended to use them. Her arguments rehearsed not to the point of rigidity, but to the point of confidence, the difference being that rigidity is recitation and confidence is knowledge that can move. The meeting room and the survey office held 7 people. The director, 2 senior archaeologists, an attorney from the State Heritage Law Division, a representative from the Federal Review Office who had driven down from Kansas City, and on her side of the table, Nora and Thomas and Walt. The director was a woman in her early 60s named Harriet Drummond, who had the particular manner of someone who has been in a bureaucratic institution long enough to have developed the ability to be simultaneously cautious and sharp. She had clearly read the complete filed argument, not just the cover summary, the full 23 pages, and her questions reflected it. The attorney's questions were the careful questions of someone protecting the agency's legal position. Nora had expected this and had prepared for it. The federal representative's questions were the specific questions of someone who had received the filing read Amelia Sato's field report and arrived having already concluded that the site met the federal threshold. He was there to observe the state's process, and his presence in the room meant that the state's process now had an audience that outranked it. Paul had called the survey director 4 times. Nora made a mental note to thank him more specifically than she had. The meeting ran 2.5 hours. Nora presented the written argument. Walt presented the hydrological analysis. Thomas presented the cultural center's position on the significance of the oral tradition accounts in relation to the physical evidence. The director asked precise questions. The attorney asked guarded ones. The federal representative asked the question that in a different kind of meeting would have been asked first: what is the appropriate outcome here? Nora answered it directly. Formal recognition of the winter habitation site under the National Historic Preservation Act, with a comprehensive site boundary assessment and a recommendation to the Federal Review Office for inclusion in the Osage Removal Historical Record. She paused. My father submitted this evidence twice. He was right. The documentation now satisfies every criterion the survey requires, and the federal threshold is clearly met. The appropriate outcome is to say so. Harriet Drummond looked at her for a moment. You're a history teacher, she said. Retired, Nora said, which gives me time to be thorough. Something in the director's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but adjacent. We'll send our formal response within 30 days, she said. It will recommend the federal assessment. It was not a celebration, it was a sentence, a contained, official bureaucratic sentence with no drama in it. It was enough. The survey's formal response came in 26 days. It was as Harriet Drummond had said, it would be a recommendation for the federal assessment. It was also in a paragraph buried in the middle of the document, an acknowledgement that the two prior submissions from Marcus Callaway had presented evidence consistent with the current findings, and that the delay in formal response had been procedurally suboptimal. This was, Nora had explained to Paul, when he read it over the phone and expressed some frustration with the language, the institutional equivalent of saying they'd been wrong, and you were not going to get more than that from a government body in a formal written document unless someone was going to court, which they were not. Procedurally suboptimal, Paul repeated in the tone of a man who found the phrase aesthetically offensive. It's in the record, she said. That's what matters. The record says my father was right. He deserved to know it while he was alive. Yes, she said, he did. She paused. But he knew it. That's different from being told by an institution. He knew because he'd walked the land and read the sources and corresponded with Thomas and done the work to the standard where knowing was not a matter of hope. He didn't need the survey to tell him. She paused. He just needed someone to finish it. Paul was quiet for a moment. Are you finished? No, she said. This is the beginning of the federal process. It will take years. She looked at the work table, which had evolved again, the original research material supplemented now with the October meeting notes, the Dr. Sato field report, the survey response, the preliminary federal review correspondence. But the foundation is in. The record exists. It cannot now be set aside. She paused. That's what we came here for. She drove back to the cabin for Thanksgiving. The weather had turned first hard frost in early November. The sycamores bear the river running dark and clear and cold in the shortened days. She drove down in the late afternoon, and the gravel road through the sycamore corridor was familiar now in every detail. The ruts and the root crossings and the place where you had to ease left to avoid the soft shoulder. And she drove it the way she drove things she knew without having to think about it, which left room for other thinking. The cabin held the cold, but the wood stove brought it up quickly. She had stocked wood in October. Paul had helped with the borrowed efficiency of a man who does not know how to split wood, but can stack it with an insurance adjuster's thoroughness. She built a fire and it caught first try, which she considered confirmation that she had done the stacking correctly, and she sat in the chair by the window with a blanket and a glass of her father's whiskey. She had found a bottle in the cabinet, unopened the good kind, and watched the November river in the fading light. Thomas came on Wednesday. They had been talking by phone twice a week since October. The federal process had begun its preliminary documentation phase, and there was considerable coordination required. He came with a folder of new materials, correspondence from the Osage Nation's legal team in Pawhuska, who had been engaged by the Cultural Center's request, a preliminary assessment from the Federal Review Office, setting the first field survey for the following spring, a letter from Dr. Sato's colleague at the Smithsonian Institution requesting to include the Callaway Briggs research maps in an exhibition on Midwest Indigenous land history scheduled for 2027. Nora read the Smithsonian letter twice. An exhibition, she said. They want the original maps, Thomas said. Loaned, not donated. Your father's drafting work, as they described it, as exceptional, which is the Smithsonian's way of saying they've rarely seen volunteer field research at this level. She looked at the map series on the work table. 14 maps, her father's careful hand, 4 summers of precise documentation. The confirmation point notations she had inked in. The section lines, the spring, the elevated bank, the north tributary, the entire landscape of a history that had been known by the people who lived it and forgotten by the ones who came after and reconstructed painstakingly by a retired high school history teacher who had decided that normal was unacceptable. He would have said it wasn't exceptional, she said. He would have said it was what the work required. He'd be right, Thomas said, but the Smithsonian isn't wrong. She thought about her father in this cabin in the chair where she now sat with the binoculars on the shelf and the notebooks filling up, doing the work that he had told no one about because he was not ready and then ran out of time. She thought about the specific loneliness of work that you cannot yet share the particular discipline of building something in private until it is ready to be seen. She thought about what it had cost him. She thought about what it had been worth. Tell them yes, she said. Walt came on Thursday evening, Thanksgiving itself. He brought a roasted chicken because it was what he made, and bread because he always had it, and a bottle of wine because it was a holiday, and he had decided apparently that the occasion warranted it. They ate at the table by the window, and the conversation moved through the things it always moved through, and also through the things that Thanksgiving makes available, that ordinary evenings don't the space to say what you mean about the year that's been. I called Thomas in 2018 before Marcus did, Walt said when they were finishing the wine. I had found the early survey maps, the Army Corps archived materials from the pre-dam surveys, the ones that showed the cultural sites. I wanted to know what the Osage Nation knew about those sites, whether there were records, whether they had been acknowledged anywhere in the official record. He paused. Thomas told me about Marcus. Said there was a man on the river, retired teacher doing the same kind of research from a different direction. He suggested we correspond. I didn't know you reached out first, she said. Your father made more of the running, Walt said. He had the field knowledge. I had the technical archive access. It was a... He paused, choosing the word natural collaboration. He never told me, she said. He told me about you, Walt said. Every letter. He said, you're going to understand things that I can only document. He said, you know how to make an argument that a room full of people have to take seriously. He said he was waiting until the research was ready. Nora held her wine glass. He waited too long, she said. He did, Walt agreed without softening it. That was his failing. He was a patient man in ways that were sometimes too patient. A pause. You fixed it. We fixed it, she said. He looked at her, the level, unhurried look that was his constant manner, and nodded once in the way of a man who accepts correction when it is accurate. We fixed it, he said. Outside, the November River moved in the dark, cold, and clear, and entirely itself. The fire in the wood stove held steady. The research was spread on the work table the way it had been since May, organized and reorganized into the current best state of the argument, which was better than it had ever been, and would be better still by spring when the federal field survey arrived. What do you do now? She said, not challenging, genuinely asking. Walt at 71 with his wife buried at Shell City and his career behind him and his debt to the river being now in the process of being accounted for. He looked at the work table. I teach a continuing education course at the community college in Nevada, he said. Water systems management. Twice a year. He paused. I've been thinking about adding a unit, pre-contact river use, the land knowledge of the people who managed these systems for centuries before the Corps arrived. He looked at her. I'm not a historian. I'll need someone to review the materials. I'll review the materials, she said. I know, he said. The first winter workshop happened in December. It was Nora's idea. She had proposed it to the Shell City Historical Society in October, 3 weeks after the state survey meeting, while she was still riding the organized energy of having done a hard thing and done it well. A local history workshop, 4 sessions the general public invited, focused on the Osage River Valley from pre-contact to post-removal, using her father's research as the core materials. Thomas had contributed the Cultural Center's publicly available materials and agreed to attend the final session. Dr. Sato had sent a brief presentation the grad student had assembled about the field findings. Paul had made 4 phone calls to the Shell City City Hall, which had provided the meeting room at no charge. 14 people came to the first session, not a large number. She had expected 12 based on the Historical Society's estimate of local interest and had prepared accordingly. 14 was not a triumph, but 14 people in a community room in Shell City, Missouri on a December Tuesday evening, sitting with her father's maps laid out on tables around the perimeter, listening to a retired history teacher explain the specific and continuous and long-suppressed history of the land they lived on of 14 people who had not known this and who left knowing it was not nothing. It was, in fact, the specific things she had come here to do. She had spent 31 years teaching students that history has present consequences, that the past is not over, that the obligation of a person who understands what happened is to make sure other people understand it too. She was still teaching. The room was different. The students were different. The history was the history she had spent the past 7 months learning to understand completely. She was a history teacher. She had always been a history teacher. The difference was that now she was teaching the right history in the right place at the right time. After the first workshop, she walked to the car alone. The December night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the stars unusually sharp, the kind of night the Ozarks does particularly well. The street was quiet. The community room behind her held the sound of people gathering their things and talking, the specific post-talk sound of an audience that has been given something to think about and is beginning to think about it. She stood beside the car for a moment and looked at the sky. She thought about the letter she had put on Hardwick's desk in April, the resignation, the end of 31 years, the morning she had driven home and sat in her kitchen and understood that she had done the most frightening thing she had ever done, and that it was right. She thought about the drive south in May, the gravel road through the sycamores, the cabin with the porch railing leaning and the roof needing attention. She thought about the box in the trunk marked Cabin Dad's Research that she had not opened for 3 years and had carried to the Osage River and opened on a rainy Thursday while the river rose outside. She thought about her father sitting in his canvas chair by the window, with his binoculars and his notebook watching the river, with the complete loving attention of a man who understood that paying attention is the most important thing a person can do, and that the world rewards it with more than you can use in one lifetime. She thought about this spring, May, the water that remembers running clean and cold from the limestone in the North Tributary, the same water her father had stood beside 3 weeks before he died, and written 3 sentences about the same water the Osage families had named and returned to for generations, the same water that would be running long after the last file was closed on the Federal Review and the last form was signed and the last person who remembered this summer was gone. The water doesn't know it's been remembered. It just keeps running. She had come here to find out who she was without her job. It turned out she was exactly who she had always been. She had been a history teacher for 31 years. She was a history teacher now. The institution had changed. The history had found its correct subject. The work was the same work carried into a room that was finally large enough for it. She got in the car and drove back down the highway toward the gravel road and the sycamores and the cabin and the river, which was running cold and dark and entirely itself in the December night, doing what it had always done, remembering everything. In the spring of the following year, while the Federal Field Survey team was doing its preliminary work on the North Tributary, marking, photographing, measuring, doing the official and permanent work of establishing what Marcus Calloway's research had already established, because institutions need their own process even when the answer is already known. Nora found a 4th notebook. It was not in the work table drawer. It was in the canvas chair, specifically in the side pocket of the canvas chair, which was a pocket she had not investigated because she had been using the chair as a chair and had not thought to check its pockets, which was the kind of thing that happens when you are busy and are not expecting to find anything. She found it on a Tuesday in May, a year to the month from her arrival. She was moving the chair to give the field survey team better access to the front window when the notebook slid partway out of the pocket and she saw the edge of her father's handwriting on the cover. Not a field notebook, a different kind, smaller, personal, the kind you keep for thoughts rather than data. She sat in the chair and read it. It was dated in the familiar month and day format ranging from 2017 to June 2021. It was not the field record that was in the 3 worktable notebooks, meticulous and sourced and organized for a future researcher. This was the other thing, the inside account, the thinking underneath the documenting, what it had felt like to spend 4 summers on this work that nobody knew about, that had no institutional support, that might never go anywhere. He had written about the frustration of the survey rejections. He had written about the cold spring mornings in the field walks, in the conversations with Thomas, in the slow accumulation of evidence. He had written about the feeling of doing work that mattered in a space that was invisible, the specific, complicated dignity of working seriously on something that the world had not yet decided to care about. And in the last pages, the ones he had written in the days before June 3rd, 2021, he had written about her. Not about the project, not about the evidence, not about the argument, about her. About the 31 years she had spent in classrooms making students understand why history mattered. about the way she had, without knowing it, without any of the specific content of his research, been doing the same work he was doing, building the argument, making the case, teaching people that the past is not past. He had written, "She will know what to do with this. She will know because she has been doing it all her life, only without the specific subject. The subject is here. The argument is built. I am only waiting for her to be ready." And then underneath that, in the last entry dated June 1st, 2021, 2 days before he had written, "This is the place. The work takes as long as it takes. You cannot make the river run faster. You can only watch it carefully and record what you see and give the record to someone who will know what to do with it. That is what a historian does. That is what I have done. That is what she will do. I am not worried." Nora sat in the canvas chair by the window for a long time with the notebook in her hands. Outside, the Federal Survey team moved along the North Tributary in their careful official way, measuring and recording and doing the work of formal acknowledgement that her father had spent 4 years building toward. The spring morning was clear, the Osage running at its proper level after the winter recession, the sycamores putting out their first pale new leaves. She thought about the specific quality of trust that the notebook represented. Not blind trust, not the trust of someone who couldn't imagine failure, but the trust of a man who had spent 31 years watching his daughter do the work and had concluded on evidence that she would know how to finish his. She thought about the letters he had written to Walt and Thomas, building the partnerships she would need without telling her they existed. She thought about the box labeled in her own handwriting that he had left where she would find it when she was ready. She thought about the 4 notebooks, 3 for the documentation and 1 for the thinking underneath it, the personal account that nobody needed to see except the person who needed to understand why the work had mattered enough to do. She thought about steadiness, the specific, unshowy kind that doesn't require an audience to function, that does the work in a canvas chair by a river window on 4 summer mornings a week for 4 years, building something carefully enough that it doesn't fall apart when someone else has to carry it. She thought, "You patient man, you extraordinary patient man." The river moved outside. The survey team's voices carried faintly from the tributary. Somewhere in the sycamores, a woodpecker was doing its own meticulous work on the bark. She opened the notebook to the first page and read it from the beginning. She took notes. End of What the River Remembers, CB 51 complete. The Smithsonian exhibition opened in March of the following year. Nora flew to Washington for it. Claire came too, and Thomas and Walt drove up separately in the F-150 because he said he had a route he wanted to take. She did not press for details. She had learned that Walt's reasons were always good and that they were his to explain or not. The exhibition was called Beneath the Current: Indigenous Land Histories of the American Midwest. It occupied 3 rooms in the museum's American History Wing. The Callaway Briggs research maps were in the central display, all 14 reproduced at full scale with archival precision. Her father's drafting hand in every line, her notation at the confirmation point visible to anyone who knew to look. The exhibition text had been written in consultation with Thomas and the Osage Nation Cultural Center by Nora. She stood in the gallery on the opening evening and read her own words on the museum wall. The maps in this exhibition are the work of Marcus Callaway, a retired high school history teacher from Jefferson City, Missouri, who spent the last 4 years of his life documenting the history of a stretch of the Osage River Valley that most Missourians have never thought to ask about. He was not a credentialed archaeologist. He was a man who understood that paying attention is the most important thing a person can do, and that the world rewards it with more than you can use in one lifetime. He died in June 2021 before the work could be formally acknowledged. The work has since been acknowledged. The river was always there. Claire stood beside her and read it too. "You wrote that," Claire said. "He lived it," Nora said. "You both did," Claire said. "That's the point, isn't it? That's what the exhibition is about. It's not just the Osage history, it's the history of who pays attention to history and why and what it costs and what it's worth." Nora looked at her daughter, the dark hair and the Thomas eyes and the spine she had given her, and the intelligence she had not known was this particular shape until this moment. "You should have been a history teacher," Nora said. "I thought about it," Claire said. "I decided hospital administration had better hours." She paused. "I was wrong about the hours. I was probably right about the fit. You're good at what you do. So are you." Claire looked at the maps. "You always were. You just didn't have the right subject yet." Nora thought about this, about the 31 years of good work she had done in classrooms that were not quite right, in the 7 months of better work she had done on a river that was, and the difference between a person who has found the correct application for their specific competence and a person who has not. She thought about the canvas chair by the window, the binoculars, the notebooks, the water that remembers. He knew before I did, she said. Fathers usually do, Claire said, with the tone of a woman who is saying something she expects to understand better when she is older. Nora put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. They stood together in the gallery and looked at the maps, the 14 sections of a valley's history, the documentation of a people's presence and the evidence of what had happened to it drawn in the careful hand of a man who had decided that normal was unacceptable and had spent 4 years proving why. The exhibition ran for 8 months. 14 people came to the first workshop in Shell City. By the 4th session, it was 31.
Mas, tu,
The federal site assessment was formally completed in June, 1 year after Nora had arrived at the cabin. Thomas called her at 7 in the morning. She was already at the work table reading the revised draft of the paper she and Thomas and Amelia Sato were co-authoring for the Missouri Historical Review, the full scholarly argument sourced and footnoted and peer-reviewed, the kind that goes into the permanent record of a field and cannot be undone. It's done, he said. The winter habitation site is formally recognized. The boundary assessment includes the spring and the north tributary. The Osage Nation's territorial mapping of the site is now in the Federal Register. She looked out the window at the river, which was running at its early summer level, clear and green over the gravel, the wood ducks back on the far margin, the kingfisher working the near bank with the focused efficiency of something that has one job and does it completely. My father submitted twice, she said. He was right twice, Thomas said. The record says so now. She sat with the phone in her hand and the river outside and the morning light on the maps on the work table and her father's mechanical pencil in the supply cup, and she felt what she had felt in the survey director's office in October, not triumph, which was too simple. Something quieter and therefore truer. Thank you, she said to Thomas, for everything. Marcus started it, he said. You finished it. I only verified that what you both said was true. A pause. That's what we do. She hung up. She sat for a moment. She picked up the mechanical pencil. She opened the research notebook she had started in May, her own, not her father's, and she wrote, June, the federal assessment is complete. The site is formally recognized. The river is running at proper summer level. The first workshop series ended in April. The second series begins in September. Walt's Community College course now includes 3 sessions on pre-contact river land use. I reviewed the materials in February. The paper with Thomas and Amelia goes to the journal next week. Claire is coming in July with her husband. Paul called Tuesday to report that the state survey director has resigned and the new director is, by Paul's assessment, less allergic to being wrong. Dr. Sato's student, the one who calls himself Marcus, is doing his dissertation on Osage land, used patterns in the Lake of the Ozarks region. He asked if I would serve on his committee. I said yes. She paused. Dad, the river remembers. So does the Federal Register now. So will the journal article, in the exhibition catalog, in Walt's course notes, in the 14 people who came to the first workshop, and the 31 who came to the last one, and whoever comes after them. You were right, it takes as long as it takes. We finished it.
o tu é que daí, então,
She walked to the spring that afternoon, the same walk she had made 100 times since May of the previous year, down the bank north along the tributary 200 yards to where the limestone came up through the soil, and the spring emerged from the rock face in its steady, cold, unhurried thread. She stood there without measuring it, without photographing it, without recording anything. She had done all of that. The record was complete. She just stood and listened to the water come out of the stone. The water that remembers. The spring that had been here before the Osage named it and would be here after the last paper on it was filed. The physical fact of a place that had been known and loved and lost and found again, not because the water had stopped running, it had never stopped, but because someone had finally stood in the right place and listened to what it was saying. Her father had stood here and heard it. She stood here and heard it too. The water came out of the rock the way it always had, clean and cold, making its quiet sound running down the tributary to join the river, joining the river to join whatever was downstream, going where water goes, which is everywhere eventually, which is why it remembers everything. She took out her notebook. She wrote 3 words. Then she closed the notebook and stood in the spring's good cold air, And let the sound of it be enough the way sounds are enough when you have stopped waiting for them to mean something and have started letting them simply mean what they are. The spring ran. The river ran. Nora Calloway stood at the edge of a correctly documented history and understood that she was not finished. Not even close.